Mark Dolan, GB News royalty with your perfect start to the weekend. Lucky us! Feisty and fearless guests.
Well, I'm a normal person, so ask me.
Honest opinions that raises more questions than a Gary Barlow tax return. And a few surprises along the way. Might be cold in this studio. That is Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan. 8 to 9 only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the arguments. We get rid of the disrespect. And then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together and what have we got, in my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Mark Dolan tonight is your weekend dose of news, debate and entertainment. This sounds like a wild conspiracy theory. Don't miss my big opinion. Mark meets and my take at 10. Democracy is a funny old thing. And we don't do boring, not on my watch. I just won't have it. Go and get another glass of that bubbly, you've earned it. That's Mark Dolan tonight, Saturday and Sunday, 9 to 11, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Are the newspapers getting you down?
My wife didn't divorce me that month.
Struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff?
I know that it's a bit of a circus at the best of times.
Well, don't worry, Headliners has got you covered. We'll take the burden of reading the day's news, and if we get depressed, who cares? It's an occupational hazard, frankly. That's Headliners on GB News from 11 p.m. till midnight, and the following morning, 5 till 6 a.m. on GB News, the comedy channel. Nah, just kidding. Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It is 12 o'clock on the day of the state opening of Parliament. Yes, the King has delivered a speech outlining more than 35 bills that the new government will be introducing over the course of this parliamentary session.
Yes, and of course there was an awful lot to get stuck into from that King's speech. As Tom says, 35 bills announced. So we'll be analysing what exactly the new Labour government has in store. But of course, reflecting on what is a momentous occasion for our country, the royal family and, of course, the Constitution. We'll have a number of fantastic guests with us throughout the show.
We should say that we are just waiting for the King to leave the Palace of Westminster. This is, of course, a full-scale pomp and pageantry ceremony. It's not one of those dressed-down years where the King doesn't wear his full crown, his royal regalia. That's all here today. It's a proper, full-scale state opening. Delighted to be joined in the studio by the former Government Special Advisor James Price and the political and constitutional historian Dr Luke Blaxhill. Dr Luke, we're going to start with you. This is, of course, an ancient ceremony that hasn't changed much over the course of the years.
Well, it has and it hasn't. There are certain aspects of it which date right back to the 14th century, certain ways in which the monarch makes the procession to the Palace of Westminster, but many of the actual things that you see, the precise order of the route that the monarch takes, many of the actual noble offices that are seen and in what order have changed considerably throughout the years. And it was really in the 19th century, and especially at the beginning of the 20th century, where the monarch really begins to take front and stage again and actually reads out the speech. So I think the crucial thing with this is it's designed to be reinvented, to be changed, to emphasise certain traditions rather than merely be a sort of grey, servile acquiescence to what had gone before.
Interesting. So it was actually, there was a period where perhaps in the Victorian age, Queen Victoria didn't read out the speech, and it was brought back in the 20th century. Right,
that's exactly the case. Queen Victoria did begin by reading out some speeches, but then increasingly didn't do so. And it was her son, Edward VII, who really put his sort of flag, in the ground and said, I'm going to make the state opening of Parliament something that really brings together the crowned, dignified part of the Constitution with the efficient technical part of Constitution, the Commons. And the crucial thing to remember about this period of history, of course, is that the role of the monarchy, due to the democratisation of Parliament, due to, in some respects, growth of Republican sentiment, was really trying to find its place in the new Constitution. And so, therefore, the King managing to put himself in a position where he could be combined with some of the technical aspects of the Constitution, really cementing the role of the monarchy moving forwards.
And was that a personal choice on the part of Queen Victoria not to read the speech?
Yes, it was a personal choice. I mean, at that point, of course, there was a lot more that the monarch could even do with the speech. I mean, Victoria didn't just get the speech handed to her. She was able to actually place sections in it that she wanted. For example, in 1886, she made her own views on Gladstone's Irish policy very, very clear.
Now, I should say we're looking at the King now in the first carriage making his exit from the Palace of Westminster. Of course, through that grand archway in Victoria Tower, which is the archway that only the King can use, reserved only for him. Also with James Price here, former special advisor to the government. This is a great, majestic display of what it is to be British.
Yeah, absolutely right. I've just come back from a month in America, and, you know, you think it's a great country and it's got lots of things going for it, and you come back, they haven't got anything on this, have they? The kind of dignity that you see in this, the pomp, the silliness. And what it does is as we say that, this whole ceremony is about uniting the dignified and the tactical and the real bits of the Constitution. But in a way, it fuses them together. It takes the sting out of some of this stuff. If Keir Starmer had been made the head of state instead of just the head of government, then he would be thinking, well, now I've got all these other ceremonial aspects. You get a bit big for your boots. You see what happens to American and French presidents when they combine both of those things. But by taking that out of there and putting some of the nice, fun bits of it, as we see, into all this pomp and circumstance, it takes away some of the sting and hopefully gets us to a nicer kind of politics as well.
Now, of course, there are many different carriages here. We should say we're looking at the first carriage, the Diamond Jubilee State Coach, pulled by 6 grey horses here. Inside that grand state coach are the King and the Queen. Behind them is the glass coach with 2 bay horses and further carriages behind that as well. A real procession. Dr. Blaxill, this is, of course, something that has been there in our Constitution through many, many different governments.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that's designed to bridge that kind of continuity. We may have political upheaval in our Constitution. We may see transitions between the life and deaths of political parties. We may see points of national crisis. But these ceremonies, whether it's just something as mundane as watching the same carriage proceed on the same route, the monarch going through the same entrance, create a sense of continuity in the Constitution and enable something which in many other countries can cause profound violence and instability, the transition of one very long government to what could be another very long government, to happen in a peaceful, democratic and highly symbolic and ritualised manner.
I mean, you make that point very strongly. James, I imagine you would agree on the importance of these types of ceremonies, these types of processions, this state opening of Parliament, but there are a lot of people who are increasingly sceptical of this sort of thing. What would you say to them?
Are there really?
Well, we've seen the protesters outside there. We've got people commenting on our news feeds saying, you know, what's all this about?
So I was the Chief of Staff in the Cabinet Office when Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth II died, the second day of Liz Truss's short-lived premiership. And my old boss, Nadeem Zahawi, and I were in charge of organising that funeral, and it was obviously a terrifying thing to have to do straight into a new job. If you looked at Twitter when that happened, you would assume half the country was Republican.
Yes.
But we got all the data and sentiment analysis from the boffins in the Cabinet Office, and His Majesty King Charles III's first statement has something like a 98-99% approval rating, which is just unheard of in a democratic society. I don't think we need to be worrying about the weakness of the monarchy for a long time yet. Don't listen to the naysayers.
And I suppose, Dr. Blaxill, this all seems like it is incredibly expensive because you see a lot of gold, you see these coaches, you see all... But, I mean, we already had the crowns. We already had the ermine. We already had all of the sort of golden elements of this ceremony. We're just getting them out of the cupboard.
Yeah, you could say we're getting good value for our investment. Yeah, in all seriousness, the actual price of this ceremony is not very high because the vast majority of people who are not, paid officers are obviously doing this voluntarily. And so it's not as though there's a large wage bill that's being chalked up. It's not as though there's such an enormous security bill because it is happening already in venues that are already secure. And so the kind of cost argument that you might have seen pulled out about, for example, the coronation or the Queen's funeral, I don't really think applies to the state opening of Parliament. And so I think that that's a little bit of a silly objection if it is being made.
And just go and look in France when you have these sorts of ceremonies, right? Down the Champs-Élysées, they have huge numbers of soldiers and pomp and circumstance, but instead of a divinely anointed king, you've got Emmanuel Macron going down it as well. It's not like Republican countries don't have this kind of pomp and circumstance as well. And how many tourists do we get coming to the UK to go and see the changing of the guard and trooping the colour and all these lovely things? And, you know, the economics would just pay for themselves in terms of tourism alone, let alone the importance of it to our constitution.
And that is such an important thing about Britain, a society that arguably hasn't had a revolution. Of course, we had a civil war, but people argue as to whether that was a revolution or not. We've had generally a sense of an evolving political and monarchical culture that stretches back 1,000 years.
Exactly. And it is that evolutionary tradition, the constitutional monarchy, as it is properly called, the fact that it is a monarchy, but it only governs with the consent of Parliament. We had the Glorious Revolution in 1688, where James was expelled from the throne and William was offered the throne in his place by Parliament. But from that moment, the monarch only governed with the consent of Parliament. And it is that relationship between the Crown and the Parliament and the shifting power balances between them and the unresolved status of that argument, if you like, that you see embodied in the state opening of Parliament, which isn't just all about the Crown, it's also about Parliament as well, but also critically the continuing antagonism between them, which is actually part of our story, which is, of course, something that is evolving and, crucially, like evolving things, hasn't finished yet.
Absolutely fascinating. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Luke Blaxill. We're now going to bring in our royal correspondent, Cameron Walker. Cameron, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Tell us what's been happening then from your perspective.
Hi there, Emily. Well, it's been incredibly loud here, actually, to be honest. I mean, we've got the band, we've got one of the bands playing of the Household Division, accompanying the music as the King and Queen arrive back at Buckingham Palace very shortly. But we've also had two massive gun salutes, 41 gun salutes fired in Green Park, just behind me, which scared the tourists who were milling around waiting for the King and Queen to arrive. The first of which, by the King Street Royal Horse Artillery, was because of the state opening of Parliament. The second was because it's also the Queen's 77th birthday today. As I speak, the King and Queen are in the Diamond Jubilee state coach being escorted by the Household Cavalry back to Buckingham Palace. The King wearing his Admiral of the Fleet's uniform, and he was wearing, as you saw, his Imperial State crown inside the House of Lords chamber and sat on the throne delivering that speech. But what's also been quite funny is inside Buckingham Palace there is a member of Parliament who has effectively been taken hostage to ensure the King's safe arrival back at the palace. That MP, Mrs. Samantha Dixon, MBE, the Vice Chamberlain of the household. As soon as the King and Queen arrive back at Buckingham Palace, that hostage will be released back. It's all that pomp and pageantry, the traditions which date back centuries. Of course, the King, as head of state, is the person who can open a new session of Parliament. He has now done that. It's a very important constitutional duty, and it's been an incredibly busy summer for His Majesty the King, despite, as sometimes I think we forget, he's still undergoing cancer treatment, and he's had a very busy schedule. And because Rishi Sunak, the former Prime Minister, called a summer election, it means he's had to squeeze into his schedule yet another state opening of Parliament. And that Imperial State crown, metaphorically and literally, is quite heavy indeed. But he seems to have coped with it rather well, and he's on his way back to Buckingham Palace.
Yes, Cameron, I should say we are looking straight down the Mall right now, and we can see just in the distance those 6 grey horses pulling the King's Imperial State carriage, the Jubilee State carriage, I should say. But of course, you mentioned this this hostage-taking, and again, that speaks to the peculiar relationship between Parliament and the Crown. Dr. Luke Blaxill still with us. Of course, this also mirrors the famous ceremony of Black Rod having the doors to the Commons slammed in his face, dating back to a previous King Charles.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, both the hostage-taking and the Black Rod having the door slammed in her, in this case, face, is an ancient tradition and also symbolises that kind of antagonism. The critical point with the beginning of those antagonisms, if you like, is, of course, Charles I, the king that tried to rule personally. In 1642, attempted to arrest 5 errant members of Parliament who were trying to undermine his personal rule, was refused by the Speaker, and this was a key event which detonated the English Civil War. And so many of the traditions you see, like the famous slamming of the door in Blackrod's face, are designed to symbolise the independence that Parliament has from the Crown, but nonetheless also the fact that the Crown is still involved in our Constitution.
Now, as we're watching this rather magnificent footage, I must say, of the Mall there and the procession, may I ask you a bit of a silly question, perhaps? How does one go about becoming Black Rod?
In terms of an actual sort of appointment?
Yes, how is it appointed?
Well, I don't think it has a large number of particular functions apart from this ceremonial one, although there is a general role for security of the palace, and there have been a number of long-running Black Rods over the years, although I would think, as is the case with a lot of royal sinecure positions, probably the job descriptions aren't exactly, available on job websites for any applicant.
Can't just apply.
Although I could be happy to be put wrong on that score.
Well, so the current Black Rod, her name is Sarah Clark. And she actually used to be head of security at Wimbledon, down at the Lawn Tennis Association for the tennis tournament. And I think actually she does have a very big role in terms of the rest of the security of the palace as well. And so there's an interlinking, of course, with the police function inside Parliament with the parliamentary authorities. And so we'll be talking with the Speaker of the House of Commons and the Lord Speaker and the House of Lords as well. So again, it's all these things. It's not just ceremonial to see the different bits of the state linking together like this. You see it in the actual way that the Parliament is run. You see it in the architecture as well. On the route that you've seen the commoners go from the House of Commons to the Lords, you see in all the architecture in the images, you see crowns mixed with sort of ancient chivalric fleur-de-lis, mixed with bits about the 4 nations of the UK, and all these things all mixed in together to try and push these 4 nations and different bits of constitution together in exactly, as Dr Blackstone was saying, this kind of amalgam we've got now.
And it is a complete amalgam. The whole of Parliament. You have the royal end and you have the common end for the commoners. It's always quite funny to say that people like Jacob Rees-Mogg were a commoner, but of course they were in the House of Commons. And you have that melding together of a royal palace, as it is a royal palace. Westminster is where I think King Henry VIII first brought the royal court, or at least massively expanded the royal court to that part of London.
Right. I mean, I think that the really sort of governing principle here is that this building that this is taking place in now is a new one. Of course, it was burned down in a fire in 1834. The current monarch's entrance, the configuration of the current Parliament was built with this state opening in mind in 1852. The building is designed to fulfil this specific purpose, to be able to allow the monarch to make that separate entrance into the House of Lords, not go near the House of Commons, where, of course, they have not set foot since that fatal event in 1642 that I mentioned. And so it's designed to be something royal, but also something that is critically separate, a forum where both the Crown and the common elements of the Constitution can both engage in constitutional ritual in the same physical location.
And one thing that was mentioned in the King's speech, of course, is constitutional reform, James. I mean, we'll talk more about the contents of the King's speech in the rest of the show, of course. But House of Lords reform, scrapping hereditary peers.
Yeah, well, as a commoner myself, certainly a common political beast, that's the bit I'm desperate to get my teeth into at some point. I think it's a bit of constitutional vandalism, actually, to get political about this. We still, I don't think, have recovered from the kinds of constitutional reforms that Tony Blair's last Labour government put in, by scrapping most of the hereditaries, by taking the law lords out and putting in the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, which I think has been a complete failure. I'm sure we can get lots of people calling in about that. But you'll remember, was it Baroness Hale with her little spider brooch saying that the proroguing of Parliament was unconstitutional and all these sorts of things. But to now get rid of these people and to have His Majesty the King, who is there because of, well, some would say by God, but some would certainly say by his mother, being his predecessor, having to sit there on that lovely golden throne and read out that they will be trying to get rid of the rest of the hereditaries, who, it pains me to say, as someone with a kind of chip on my shoulder about these things, when I worked in the House of Lords, were far and away the hardest working, the most diligent people, who understood their place in the Constitution better than most, who understood the sense of duty and service to this great country. The fact that Starmer can come along now and thinks he wants to tear all this stuff out, I'd say that he's got a mandate to do all sorts of things with the economy and planning laws and all these things if he wants to, but to go mess with the House of Lords when it works so much better than the rest of the country almost, I think would be a big, big mistake.
But the magic of our constitution is that we will never know, probably, what the king makes of it all. Your views on the hereditary peers, if you have any?
Well, I mean, I think that there have been several changes, major changes to the Lords over time. We had the most major, perhaps, is the Parliament Act in 1911, where the Lords loses its absolute veto over the Commons. That's the major moment where, remember, before that, you also have Prime Ministers sitting in the House of Lords, and so that's the major moment where the Commons really gains its kind of supremacy. I think the first set of Blair reforms, I believe in 97, 98, were much more destructive for one that cares about the hereditary aspect of the Constitution. That removed many more of them. But the remaining 92, of course, whom were chosen from amongst the hereditary peers that remained by a sort of definition, I suppose, were the cream of that particular crop.
And ironically, they're the only ones who are elected.
Yes, ironically,
selected,
elected in a manner of speaking, certainly. Yeah. But it's certainly interesting that, without really, I think, any debate, or at least as I could tell, about the status of the hereditary peers, and they represent, in their own way, I think, something quite important, which is, of course, hereditary legislators, in the functional part of the Constitution. That is a quite important principle that we would be removing by removing these remaining 92 hereditaries. So it's a shame there's not been a debate about the subject, whereas I think there were vigorous debates about the Parliament Act and reasonable, although not perhaps vigorous enough for my liking, debates on the removal of the first hereditaries by the Blair ministry.
And it seems that this whole argument has perhaps to some extent misunderstood the role of the House of Lords. People talk about it as the second largest legislative chamber in the world, as if it was designed that every single lord should attend every single sitting all of the time, rather than a body that has a pool of talent on which it can draw issue by issue. To some extent, should we be concerned about the size of the Lords when only a certain percentage of them might want to turn up on any given subject? It's supposed to be, perhaps, a pool of experts rather than professional politicians who are there every day.
Yeah, we should be concerned about the size of it. It's not nearly large enough. we need to have a lot more experts going in there and weighing in on these things. No, but seriously, when you see, again, the House of Lords has a bad rep, but when you see how it works behind the scenes, and I was the special advisor to the leader of the House of Lords for several years through things like Brexit and COVID, the ceremonial job, all you ever got to see of her was holding the cap of maintenance, as you saw a lady there, Baroness Smith, holding this archaic hat.
Very odd. Do explain that, because a lot of people were saying, why wasn't she wearing the hat on her head? She was holding it on a stick.
I think it was I'll let Dr. Blackstone correct me. I think it was a gift from the Pope to Henry VIII before his break with the Church of Rome. And so it's a symbol of him being defender of the faith, which is now still a title the monarch has. Of course, it's a slightly tweaked faith now. And, of course, one of the other wonderful ceremonial bits is that the new government chief whip in the Lords and deputy chief whip, they have also lovely titles, I think, Captain of the Honourable Company of Gentlemen at Arms and the Captain of the Yeomen of the Guard. And one of their jobs to get dressed up in all the finery and the red coats and everything, to go down into the basements and make sure there are no naughty Roman Catholics trying to blow it up the way that Guy Fawkes and co did. It's a wonderful bit that you don't get the cameras to see, unfortunately.
No, there you go, the traditional scoping of the cellars.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know quite if that has a sort of a formal ritual, because it's not actually seen. But of course, at the beginning, the beginning of the 17th century, we did have a ton and a half of dynamite placed rather close to where the monarch would have been sitting, and so it's probably a good idea to do at least some spring cleaning to make sure that hasn't reappeared.
Shall we go back to 1834? Because I wonder, looking at the House, looking at Parliament as a whole, it looks like some splendid medieval palace, but it's Victorian. And looking at Buckingham Palace, as we were just seeing, you think of this sort of symbol of the monarchy that's lasted 1,000 years, but again, the frontage of that palace was Victorian, or at least 1800s. Of course, the back bit is a bit older, but sort of all of these symbols of these sort of institutions are perhaps a bit more modern than we'd like to think.
Absolutely. I mean, London is in many respects a Victorian city. It's an imperial city. When we look at these institutions and these buildings, there's a very strong and visceral reaction to them, and it is a deference to history. But of course, it's a history that isn't just something that's been organically evolved in this way. There have been moments where these buildings were designed to specifically evoke grandeur, to specifically evoke occasions, where the monarch would be present, but also commoners would be able to look mighty and powerful. And on that, one might argue Britain and the Empire was built.
Slightly off topic, my favourite fact of these is Tower Bridge. Designed to, of course, look like the Tower of London, ornate turrets. it's actually more modern than Brooklyn Bridge. Brooklyn Bridge was built before Tower Bridge in London, which I just find extraordinary. But it does speak to perhaps that same sort of style of how we design our living architecture. The House of or rather Parliament as a whole, designed off the back of Westminster Abbey, which does have that sort of old Gothic design and where Edward the Confessor was crowned.
Yeah, absolutely. There are these reiterative links to these older kind of Gothic buildings. You see Gothic styles used architecturally many, many years later. And I think one of the reasons why we still consider Parliament today to be beautiful, which not everyone did when the new building was built, is because we probably are still in love with that kind of architectural style. And that's why Victorian buildings and, Gothic revival buildings have still the sway over people's minds that they do. If Parliament was, rebuilt to look like the Holyrood Parliament, for example, or some kind of, I don't know, sort of, modernist concrete breeze-blocked multifunctional conference space facility, it might not command quite the same, fire in people's hearts.
Yes, we weren't too overwhelmed by the Senedd the other day, were we, in Wales? James, tell me how the King's speech itself, of course, it is short, to the point. There's not a lot of detail in there about what the legislative agenda will look like. It's a bit of a shopping list, isn't it, really? How is it put together?
So functionally, I think at the start of this year, when Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister, he gave permission for the Labour Party to start having conversations with bits of the civil service, and their teams put in for all the different departments to go and talk with Labour HQ and the then leader of the opposition's office to start getting looking at the books of what was actually going on in some of these departments and start understanding some of their legislative priorities. Now, that can be from as broad as we think there's a problem in prisons, what's going on there, through to we've actually, have a better understanding of what's going on here, and we've even drafted a bill on X, Y or Z. Can you look at it and help us refine it, ready for a potential victory? And that happens every election. So even somewhere like 2019, when it was clear that Boris was going to smash Jeremy Corbyn, Corbyn's team were able to go in there and find out information from the civil service and start drafting bills and things like that for it, for that kind of eventuality. So that happens there, and that work is still being done right now. And Starmer will benefit from the fact that his Chief of Staff, Stu Gray, was a very senior civil servant for a long time and understands how all the mechanics of Whitehall works. Some of those things will be much more advanced than others, as you say, and that's when the sort of parliamentary timetabling comes into effect, what bills we're going to be putting up first. So both in 1997 and actually again in 2010, in the Department for Education, both the teams, I think it was David Blunkett in 97 and Michael Gove in 2010, they had a very clear vision for what they wanted to do with education. They had most of the bills actually already drafted and ready to go, and a very clear plan of what they were going to do and going and enacting it. Now, certainly in Gove's case, it's probably the most successful thing that government did because they were prepared and they were ready for it. Other bills will take more time, and we have a real bottleneck in the UK where there's a small team of people actually drafting the legislation to get it ready, and those people, obviously, they hold the pen. They've got an awful lot of power, unlike the American system, where it's senators and congressmen themselves whose offices draft bills, and then they go into the debating about it afterwards.
That's very interesting, thinking about which bills may get priority, how long these things take, when it's announced in the King's speech that there will be these 35 or so new bills. When will those actually come to pass?
And indeed, that number of bills higher than in the last few King's speeches or Queen's speeches as well. When the last state opening of Parliament took place, there were only around 20-odd bills put before Parliament. Now there are 35. Is that just a government that's eager to get going, or will it run into these sorts of roadblocks that you're talking about, these bottlenecks?
Yeah, I think both. I think it definitely there'll be these sorts of problems. They realise they haven't thought something through. The most powerful law in the land is the law of unintended consequences, right? The best way to make God laugh is to tell him your plans. But I think at the same time, this is the Labour Party waiting for a long time. They've got in, they've got power, and by Jove, they're going to use it. Something that my party, the Conservatives, didn't do nearly enough of. And that's something that frustrated me no end. Why it was that previous King's speeches were a lot lighter on the ground with these kinds of things. Sometimes there was understanding to it. With the Brexit shenanigans of Theresa May, everything kind of ground to a halt, and we were looking down the back of drawers for short bills to fill the time. There was one about public toilets, I remember, that I made so many jokes about that I think it actually got pushed back a bit into the timetabling schedule.
There's a lot in that King's speech that could have huge consequences, not least, of course, the constitutional bills and constitutional reforms that have been set out. No votes for 16s, I note, at least not mentioned
it might be
completely. It may be within the constitutional reform that they've talked about, broadening the electorate and so on. It may be included in there, but no specific mention. Very interesting.
And Dr. Luke Blackshill, we're looking, of course, at this overall as a ceremony, but also as a practicable start of a government, of a parliamentary term.
Yeah.
There is, of course, a difference, perhaps, in the number of bills and the quantity of what's in a King's Speech, depending on the size of the government's majority. Obviously, this is now a government with a very large majority, so it will perhaps be thinking about doing a lot more work.
Yes, it can do more easily. Obviously, if you have rebellions, if you have to take endless amendments to get a bill through, a knife-edge kind of common situation, that will cause delay. I mean, we saw delay perhaps most famously under the administration of Theresa May. But with his colossal majority of 174, he's better placed to pass more legislation. And actually, after this King's Speech, there will actually be a debate in the House of Commons, which will be Keir Starmer's first opportunity to show off his, newly minted awesome power through the scale of the majority that he's able to carry the speech through. It's technically possible for the government to be defeated on that, and that would be a resigning issue in itself. But the last time that happened was at the beginning of 1924, after Stanley Baldwin had lost his majority in 1923. So if that happened, that would be rather surprising, to put it mildly. And I think we might then suspect that quite a lot of Corbynists had actually got maybe instead, and something strange would occur.
There will be those who attempt to amend the King's Speech, won't there, James?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, again, these things are largely kind of ceremonial, and this is the problem that the Conservatives are going to have, to try and mount an effective opposition with only, what have they got now, 110, 120
121.
Oh, good, well. I mean, the majority, the size that Labour have, they can let a lot of their MPs off the whip for quite a long time. They can go back to their constituencies, they can go on fun, interesting trips, and they can still handily defeat all the other parties up against them. And that is just the prize and the power that Starmer has now. And so one of the things the Tories are going to need to do to try and show some competence again is to see if they can affect and mount an effective opposition rather than just opposing everything for the sake of it.
And we do make these comparisons to the United States of America, the sort of hostage that is held in Buckingham Palace. It's almost synonymous with the designated survivor during a State of the Union speech in the United States. But there is a huge difference with regard to the power of a president and the power of a prime minister with a large majority. Keir Starmer, just on sort of ability to pass legislation, has far more power now than any United States president.
Yes, because obviously, generally speaking, a president, unless he has really a very dominant position in Congress, and of course in American politics presidents tend to lose Congress during the midterm. A prime minister who of course is part of the legislative body, unlike in America where the powers are separate, has much more of an ability to, even in small majority situations, to be honest, to be able to corral his or her supporters in pursuing a legislative programme. And certainly with a very large majority, it will be extremely difficult for the government to be defeated. And thus the power that Keir Starmer has and his sort of team around him have, and also, of course, the authority he will have within the party. For many of these new MPs will know that they probably only got elected because of the red rosettes they had, or the not blue rosettes that they had, as we might say. But his power will be very similar to that we saw with Tony Blair in 1997. And certainly, if he is able to reform the House of Lords as well, perhaps obviously removing peers at the age of 80 and removing the hereditaries, that might also disproportionately remove some of his opponents from the upper house as well. So that might also help make him a bit more powerful insofar as he's bothered about the upper house.
Very interesting. And the question of devolution as well. Does that make him stronger or weaker? That's a debate.
Well, it depends where the powers are coming from. Because I think there's some debate. I noticed the King in his speech did say that he'll strengthen the powers of the Metro mayors, but it could be very well the case that the Metro mayors' powers are not coming from Westminster, but are instead coming from local authorities, from local councils. So sort of upwards devolution to those Metro mayors rather than taking power away from Westminster, perhaps.
Shall we bring in our political editor, who I believe is waiting for us? Christopher Hope, are you there for us to find out more about what was inside this King's speech? There you are, on College Green. Fantastic. Christopher, any surprises in that King's speech?
Hi Emily, hi Tom. Welcome to sunny College Green here outside the Houses of Parliament, the Palace of Westminster. The King has left me. The smell of horse manure is still in the air, but yeah, all that's gone now. We're looking forward into the House of Commons this afternoon, where the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, presenting his plans for government for the next 2 years or so, and Rishi Sunak, the man who would have been PM if he hadn't called the early election, trying to attack the government's plans for it. I'm struck by a number of things here. 40 bills or draft bills. The remarks by Keir Starmer are interesting in the beginning of it. He says there that the challenges we face require determined and patient work and serious solutions. He calls populism the snake-armed charm. It drives it into the dead end, he says, of division and greater disappointment. So clearly this is trying to reset the debate on how we do our politics after those 14 years of Tory rule. In this King's speech, 103 pages, full of detail of what lies behind the speech. I counted 15 mentions of the European Union, 0 mentions of Brexit. I am struck by that. I wonder if Brexit is now a dirty Tory word and the European Union is now a kind of friend you want to get near. So I'm watching that as a theme over the next 2 years. Fascinating to see a new Armed Forces Commissioner for Veterans. That, of course, is to deal with the issue that they've removed the Veterans Minister from the Cabinet Office and given that role back to John Healey at the Department, at the Ministry of Defence. Controversial areas here, employment rights bill, that's going to be a way to give people arriving in a company immediate rights to holiday and maternity pay. That may be a big issue for entrepreneurs, for small companies who can't afford to cover this kind of red tape. Got this budget responsibility bill, this OBR, the all-powerful OBR that Liz Truss hates, the Office for Budgetary Responsibility. That will now have a veto over far more areas of government spending. Will that be a problem for the Labour Party? I'm struck by about a quarter of the measures, if you shut your eyes, a Tory government could have brought in. It's quite interesting. Martin's Law, reducing smoking, improving football governance. Lots of carryover bills from a different party altogether. And it strikes me this is a very limited ideas in here in this bill, this King's speech. Perhaps no surprise, given the manifesto was quite limited in scope. But I think a lot of Labour activists might think, I've been waiting for 14 years for a Labour government. Is that all you've got? And I find that quite interesting. And just finally, looking further afield, the draft bills, Tom and Emily, are very interesting. A draft equality, race and disability bill. This will give a legal right to people of colour, ethnic minorities, to get the same pay as able-bodied white people. That's going to be laid in the next 2 years. That will become a big row, I expect, as well as plans to deal with conversion practice, a bill for that. So there's areas of controversy, but overall it's what we need from the manifesto, the Labour manifesto. Steady as she goes, change, but no real change.
Yes, people might suggest that isn't it already illegal to pay someone of a different race a different wage? But if Labour wants to have that argument and reiterate how illegal it is, I suppose they're allowed to do that. Chris, you mentioned these 3 bills that the Tories were actually bringing in, got abandoned in what was known as wash-up at the end of the last Parliament. The football regulator, Martin's Law, this imposition on any venue that could seat more than 100 people to train all their staff in anti-terrorism training, and of course this peculiar iterative smoking ban. You say these are things that the Conservative government could have brought in, but could it not be the case that these were fairly unconservative things that the Conservative government was doing, regulating football, regulating your local church or your local pub, and banning adults from smoking? I mean, perhaps one might think this was an example of a Conservative government behaving fairly unconservatively.
And maybe it's lost its way. I mean, you're totally right, Tom. You and I well know that before the Tory party conference, no one was saying we should ban cigarettes for anyone born after 2009. And then that came in as a legacy idea, almost Rishi Sunak's gay marriage vote. And then he decided to run out of time and call the election early. I mean, I suppose Mr. Sunak will welcome it when he speaks against Sir Keir Starmer. But yeah, many of those areas weren't really Tory areas. I think the party really had lost its way on what it believed in, and perhaps it might try to establish that as we go through the issue of leadership. I was just going to grab my documents there. You mentioned there the draft equality bill, that's because the government says there are elements that the Equality Act 2010 only applies for issues like gender, but not in the case explicitly of race and disability. So they're trying to close what they see as an issue from a historic Labour bill back in 2010.
Yes, presumably it will be like the gender pay gap reporting, whereby businesses will be compelled to put this data out into the public realm and for the government to judge, as they have done with the big companies on gender pay gap and all of that. There will be a bit of an internal battle, though, I suppose, Christopher, when it comes to this New Deal for working people. Some in the party want this to be far more far-reaching than perhaps it was in the manifesto. Do you sense that there might be a bit of a battle there between the left and the right of the party?
Well, almost certainly, and the left and businesses. You've got Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, chumming up to big business, saying that they want to encourage investment, encourage companies to invest here. There's plans, isn't there, for a sovereign wealth fund bill, which will put in a £1 of our money as taxpayers and lever off £3 from the private sector. So they're trying to get close to business, but they'll be looking at the Employment Rights Bill and worry about it. I mean, the idea of giving immediate sick pay, parental leave on day one of an employee arriving could act as a disincentive to actually hire someone, frankly, because there could be an immediate cost if that person disappears off to have a baby or is ill. That's the worry. Normally you have to wait for a few months, don't you, in a normal job to get those privileges. Fire and rehire is going. They're going to end 0 hours contracts. Again, many people do think that 0 hours contracts work for them, and surely that should be a choice the worker makes, not imposed on by government. So that whole debate, that's an Angela Rayner piece of legislation, don't forget. She's the one who championed it, although whether it falls in housing and local government or goes across to Jonathan Reynolds in business, we'll wait and see. And her role in that is interesting because she'll be the voice of the left, I think. There was reports the weekend she's been sidelined by this new administration. So if that happens, we'll see more of that kicking off in the future.
Very interesting stuff. Thank you very much, Christopher Hope, live from College Green outside the Palace of Westminster. Well, still with us in the studio are the former government special advisor James Price and the political and constitutional historian Dr. Luke Blaxill, because Dr. Luke, something else is going to happen now in the House of Commons. Members of Parliament might have a cup of tea first, but then they're going to head back to the House of Commons.
Yes, and they're going to start debating this King's speech, and that's going to be, in and of itself, very interesting. I mean, this can happen, over a period of days. There will be speeches that will be, from some people, more, I suppose, kind of humorous. Maybe lots of maiden speeches will be occurring as well, because we've had such an enormous kind of intake of new MPs that a lot of them may be speaking for the first time. You might see some humorous speeches from sort of old, wise kind of heads, but the substance of the legislation and where it may be controversial may start to sort of come apart. And we've obviously already heard about the various sort of measures, some of which are perhaps a little bit vague. Some of them have got some quite important principles in them, like it being, illegal to pay people on, different salaries and racial lines, and we can argue about whether that's actually already enshrined in law or not. But there's clearly going to be, I think, an argument about what really the Labour manifesto, we could argue, really even was. The manifesto didn't have a great deal of substance in it. That was obviously a political calculation from the Labour Party, to run on literally a change ticket. I got a leaflet through the post that had change with various pictures of sort of clip art of the countryside and people going for a jog and, some people playing basketball. And I did think, well, I imagine most people can still do this under current Conservative administration, but maybe in this this King's Speech debate, perhaps a little bit more of the substance and the key areas of antagonism might start to appear on what's the sort of change manifesto and its 45 bills, or 35 bills, I can't remember which, actually embody.
I mean, James, are you as concerned as I am about all this talk of more devolution, more powers to metro mayors and local authorities? When I look at devolution as it stands, it's not all been all rosy, has it, really?
I mean, I think live on TV right now, it's all just finally sinking in a few weeks later just how ghastly this government's going to be in all kinds of ways. This idea that it's taking the worst bits of the last Conservative government of banning more aspects of freedom from our lives, of people being able to smoke what they want, and a football regulator. And we almost won the Euros.
You worked for the administration that was introducing the football regulator, that was introducing the smoking ban.
They stopped it, though, didn't they? They decided not to pursue it
in my defence, I'd left before both of those things. And think how much worse it would have been had I not have left sooner. But, you know, some of those terrible things in there. On your point about devolution, I think it's been a decided failure in all kinds of ways. It's true that the UK is probably the most centralised government anywhere in the OECD. I think the worst bit under the Sunak administration was that local councils could apply to a little pot of money somewhere in Whitehall to get chess boards set up in local parks. I mean, you know, mad things like that.
Each of these chess boards costing £3,000 somehow. I mean, it's amazing how much more the government can spend on something than anyone else in the country might.
Yeah, I mean, on local government, I mean, the power that local government had formerly in the 19th century, where really a lot of what government did at that point were merely passing what you would call permissive legislation, for the example, demolition of slum housing, so that they could be enacted by some local authorities but not others. You'd have some local authorities like Birmingham, the so-called municipal socialist authority, that would tax its residents, the so-called ratepayers, high, and do things like, for example, you know, build water and various infrastructure, and other places where they would maybe have the sort of spendthrifts in control and would do maybe a little bit less. However, the 20th century, and especially after the local government legislation in 1928, has seen a really big centralisation of local government powers, such that mainly what local government does is distribute grants that have come from it centrally. And for all the talk of reinvesting local government with power, this has happened so many times throughout the 20th century and indeed the 21st century, and I would be amazed if it ever actually did occur.
But James, this is Angela Rayner devolution. Will this be genuine, you know, giving up of powers from Westminster, from central government, or will it, as I suspect it will be, just an additional layer of bureaucracy and potentially more tax-raising measures at the local level?
Yeah, I'm not sure what kind of odds you can get on it down at the bookies, but this is the problem. You go into these departments, you say, I'm going to make the world a better place, the Tories, they were evil, and that's why things weren't going well. And that's, I think, probably what quite a lot of the Labour politicians genuinely thought. Well, if so, their analysis is going to come up slightly short when it comes to fixing things. And you do get to a point where you go, right, I'm going to devolve power now, because I think we probably all agree, and most people listening and watching at home would agree, that decisions should be made as close to where they're going to have an effect as possible. That seems like a very sensible idea. When you're sat in one of these massive, powerful Whitehall bureaucracies, you go, no, I need to fix things. I'm a smart, caring person. I can do this better than the last lot. I'm going to start pulling levers and doing things. And if you give away those levers to do things, and you then get the criticism when things don't go right yourselves anyway, that's when you get this feeling, I want to hold on to it myself. It takes a very brave, strong, clever politician to actually have the comfort to push that power away from yourself onto others.
Well, you don't get national standards, do you? That's the problem. I mean, an addiction to national standards, a removal of the postcode lottery to say that you can get this provision, you know, wherever it might be, anywhere in the country. If you allow true localism, you must allow some deviation on the standards that are experienced by different people who may indeed be held responsible partly for that by the local elected officials that they put in. And to be able to say that, to say that we are going to have a postcode lottery because we accept local diversity, very difficult for modern politicians to do, especially perhaps from the Labour Party.
And look in America where this happens between the states. There's a law passed in California that says that schools will now not have to tell parents when children want to change gender. Well, Elon Musk is moving Tesla and SpaceX and all these things out of there into Texas. That's the kind of change you want to be able to see.
Right. Now, there's so much in this King's speech that we need to get through. We haven't even started on house building.
No, but perhaps we could speak now to the Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament for Edinburgh West, Christine Jardine. Because, Christine, now the debate turns to the House of Commons. What's the Liberal Democrat view?
Well, we've seen the speech today. It's a very different King's speech from the last one we had from the Conservative government, which was tired, out of ideas, little to inspire anyone. We've got this very energetic 40 bills that they're proposing. It's going to be a very busy period in Parliament, but we want to see the detail. There's a lot of it that sounds promising. There's a lot of it that we think that's interesting, but we need to know the details. What exactly is it they're proposing with GB Energy? Where will it be? Housing, will they be building the right houses in the right places? And, you know, rail and that renationalisation, call it what you will, it's renationalisation. What exactly will it mean? We know that our railways are in trouble, that they need help, but what exactly is it that the Labour Party are proposing? Our job's to scrutinise it, and that's what we'll be doing.
Yes, Christine, you're up in Scotland, usually. Of course, you are in Westminster right now. Do you suspect that GB Energy will create enough jobs to overcome changes in the North Sea? We've heard from Ed Miliband, well, reports from Ed Miliband earlier this week and last that he wants no new oil and gas licences in the North Sea. Will GB Energy make up for those job losses?
I don't think it's quite as simple as job losses in the oil industry, GB Energy will replace them. GB News can try this as well. GB Energy will replace them. What we have is a declining industry that needs something to help, not the jobs, but the people in it, the 100,000 people whose livelihoods, whose mortgages, whose rent are dependent on the oil and gas industry. We need a just transition to clean fuels. And so many of the people who work in that sector have the skills that we need for a sound, well-balanced, well-run, renewable energy sector. So if GB Energy can use those skills and can make sure that we don't end up with another industrial desert like we did when we lost shipbuilding, when we lost steel, when we lost mining, then good. But we need to see the detail. We need to know where it's going to be and what it's actually going to do, how many people it's going to employ, and how it's going to be effective. We need to know that.
Christine, you are now one of over 70 Liberal Democrat members of Parliament. It's the largest Liberal Democrat contingent in the House of Commons ever. It's the largest Liberal contingent in the House of Commons, if we're going to say that that's the predecessor party, since before the Second World War. But you're saying now that the last government was tired. There's a lot to be hopeful in this new King's speech. You want to see the detail, but you're sounding perhaps more like a critical friend than a member of the opposition.
Well, I think the public are a little tired of politicians who oppose for the sake of opposing. We have had 5 years of turmoil. I've been an MP for 7 years, and it started with Brexit, and we've just had one crisis after another. We've had MPs arguing. Sometimes it has seemed to the public for the sake of arguing. What I'm in Parliament to do is represent the best interests, first and foremost, of my constituents, and to make sure that I do everything I can to scrutinise the government and make sure that the legislation they bring forward is the best for the people that I represent. Now, I'm not a member of that government, so I'm not going to, be part of what they do, but if they come up with policy which, if it can be amended, will work for my constituency, or which I think can work for my constituency, I will do what I can to make sure that it works. And it doesn't matter which party they're from. If the Conservative Party had done that, I would have been the same. But I think the public are tired of us just arguing for the sake of arguing. They want constructive politics. They want people to work together for their best interests. And I think
Christine,
that's what we all got to do.
Christine,
now,
the Liberal
take away
Democrats...
this speech and look at it.
Yes, the Liberal Democrats, they represent lots of lovely leafy areas where people don't necessarily want lots of new construction and lots of new builds and the like. What do you make of Labour's plans to essentially overrule local concerns when it comes to house building? That's not going to go down very well with some of your constituents, I imagine.
Well, my constituents know exactly what it's like to have housing developments built in the wrong place. And we need to make sure that this policy of the Labour government doesn't do that. We need housing in this country. We have a housing crisis. Young people cannot get in the housing ladder. They're having to live with parents into their 30s now. So we need new houses. Our policy was to build new houses, to build more than 150,000 social houses. But they have to be the right houses in the right place. They have to have infrastructure. We want to see building on not on green belt, but on brown belt. We want to see abandoned houses, derelict houses brought back into use, office blocks that have been abandoned, they can be converted. There's lots of ways of providing new housing, but they have to come along with infrastructure. There's absolutely no use in taking a green belt site and handing it over to developers who build big expensive houses that people still can't afford, and there's no infrastructure.
Christine, you talk about
houses in the right
you talk about dilapidated
right
housing. Just today, the Mayor of London has given a consent order to build on the green belt because it so happened that there was an old house, 250 years old, that was designated as green belt land in the 1950s in Hounslow in London, and it couldn't be fixed until the green belt was amended. The Mayor of London has done that just today. Surely that shows that some brownfield land, some previously built on land, actually sits in green belt designated land.
Well, I've had some hairs split before, but that really is going to affect. Yes, there will be places where there has been housing before. There will be individual cases in the country where there was perhaps, a house before that someone wants to build on that land. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is protecting our valuable green belt and making sure that there are not massive housing developments built in the wrong place, without infrastructure, without schools, dentists, doctors, transport. That's the problem. If you're going to build, you have to make sure you build in the right place.
Yes, I guess it's the order in which that happens that is very tricky. Yeah, Christine, just lastly, you mentioned Brexit a little bit earlier. Zero mentions of Brexit in the King's speech. Has it become a bit of a dirty word? Is it best forgotten now, Christine?
Oh, Brexit's become a dirty word, but there's no way we can forget it because it's damaging British industry, British business and British life every day. But what you did have in the King's speech was perhaps not as far as Liberal Democrats would have liked, but a recognition from this Labour government that we have to repair our relationship with Europe. Yes, Brexit's a dirty word, but it's a dirty word because it's damaged Britain's prosperity and we have to move on.
OK, Christine Jardine, thank you so much for joining us, Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament for Edinburgh West, there on College Green outside Parliament. Still with us in the studio, James Price and Dr Luke Blaxill. James, what did you make of what Christine Jardine had to say?
I mean, we've got 70 Lib Dem MPs now. I'm not sure what their purpose or function is, other than to help Labour Party, as it sounds like from the start there. I remember when the former leader of the Liberal Democrats, Nick Clegg, a video of him resurfaced recently, saying there was no point in building any more nuclear power stations because some of them wouldn't be ready until 2021. Well, we're now well past that. We're in a real pickle when it comes to producing enough good, clean energy. I don't hear anyone from the Liberal Democrats trying to fix that problem particularly. I don't hear anyone actually, from anything we've just heard there, fixing the housing crisis, worrying about our precious green belt, despite you putting a great example to her of the fact that the so-called green belt is full of land that
But James, she's right, though, isn't she? She's right that in order to have more houses, you need to have the infrastructure to support those houses. It's all well and good plonking 1,000 new homes in a certain area, but if the train station's already rammo, if you've got no schools, you've got no dentists, you've got no hospitals, then, what's the point?
Well, firstly, I'm in favour of building all sorts of that as well, but I suspect that if
what comes first?
If you asked a Liberal Democrat, they would say, well, there's no point in building infrastructure if there aren't houses there. As every Liberal Democrat knows, every silver lining has a cloud.
Well, Dr Luke Blaxill, this has been a marvellous state occasion. It's also been a political occasion. What's your big takeaway?
My big takeaway, I would say one of maintenance, I suppose a little bit like the cap of maintenance. We've had a profound election, an election which produced perhaps a slightly more normal outcome than perhaps we were considering as possible, but nonetheless which produced an absolutely historic one. The Conservatives reduced their smallest number of MPs, until right back into the 18th century when it was a different party. One of the largest majorities that we have ever seen. And we've seen the transition of power happen peacefully, not just peacefully, but also with grand pomp and ceremony. We've seen, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer sharing a joke with each other.
Yes.
We've seen very famously, this happens generally between the leader of the opposition.
Luke, I'm terribly sorry.
I'm
going to have to cut you off, but it's been an absolute pleasure. Dr Luke Blaxill and, of course, James Price. We're going to be back very shortly indeed.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, welcome along to your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. A fine day out there and feeling quite warm. It's going to get a bit warmer as well over the next few days, certainly for some of us under the influence of this high pressure system. But notice there are weather fronts just creeping in towards the west. They'll bring a bit more cloud this afternoon to the west of Scotland, maybe 1 or 2 showers over the Highlands. But for most places, it's dry and fine. We had some early morning mist and some cloud is now developing. It's not blue sky everywhere, but generally sunny spells and a bit of sunshine will lift the temperatures up into the low to even mid-20s in the southeast. Could get up to 25 Celsius in the London area. A little cooler in the far northwest, and the cloud will continue to thicken across western Scotland as we go into the evening. Perhaps just a few more showers drifting in here, but for most of Scotland it is going to be a fine end to the day, with temperatures still 19-20 degrees at 5 o'clock this afternoon. Fine too in Belfast, but increasing cloud to the west of Northern Ireland. We will see a few showers just coming in here to end the day. For most of England and Wales, though, a pretty pleasant summer's evening. And it'll stay fine and dry across England and Wales overnight. But for Scotland and Northern Ireland, we will see that cloud continuing to thicken up. Outbreaks of rain trickling into Northern Ireland, certainly across western Scotland, where it could turn heavy in places towards the end of the night. Some mist and fog likely across parts of England and Wales, and maybe the odd shower into West Wales. But for most, dry. Quite a warm evening, but nothing too oppressive. 14 to 16 the low in most towns and cities. A wet start then for western Scotland on Thursday, so that rain could be heavy for a time in the morning. We'll see some showery rain across southern and eastern Scotland for a little bit of time through the middle part of the morning, and it's a dull, damp morning for Northern Ireland. But for most of England and Wales, it's another fine day, plenty of sunshine, and it is warming up as well, with temperatures maybe in the capital 28 degrees tomorrow.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
£30,000 in tax-free cash really could be yours. It's our biggest cash prize of the year so far, and you could be getting that winning call from us to tell you that you're our next Great British Giveaway winner.
I can't believe this.
Oh my God, this is amazing.
That is absolutely fantastic.
We're over the moon.
I've never won anything like this in my life.
Oh, you shocked me. I never won a penny in my life.
If I was there, I'd buy you a drink.
For another chance to win £30,000 in tax-free cash, text cash to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. You can enter online at gbnews.com/win. Entries cost £2. Or post your name and number to GB07 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 30th of August. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
GB News Breakfast. Every day from 6 a.m.
Khloe Kardashian has come under fire after posting a picture of her 6-year-old daughter wearing a full face of makeup.
Yeah, the reality TV star said the youngster was participating in a dance recital and that wasn't an everyday occurrence.
So this morning we're asking, is it ever okay to let children wear makeup?
Well, joining us now is journalist Julie Cook. So, Julie, it's a child wearing full rouge, bright red lipstick, hair tied back, looking very, very stylised, very much, I think, like a young adult. Is this really the sort of thing we should be doing with small children?
Oh, I think it's absolutely fine. I mean, first of all, in Khloe Kardashian's case, it was a dance recital, so it was very much a kind of performance element to it. She said herself in her post, it wasn't something they do every day. She was taking part in a dance activity. So, you know, I think she's vindicated on that front. But I've let my daughter play with makeup since she was 3. When she was 3, she showed a distinct interest in my makeup palettes, going through my stuff. She's 10 now, and while I don't let her wear a full face like a drag queen, I do let her wear, you know, a bit of mascara on a weekend if she wants to. I don't see any harm in it.
Clearly, if you're a child of a Kardashian who's paid millions of dollars to endorse cosmetics, you know, that's part of the fabric of their family. My concern, though, Julie, is putting those pictures on social media where people can see them. We live in an age now where, you know, wrong-uns are scouring the internet all the time.
A lot of girls do enjoy putting makeup on. It's almost like a self-expression thing. It's like painting on a canvas. They're just trying to be a bit artistic. I don't think it's necessarily as sort of sinister as we're making out. And I think as long as you're not posting pictures everywhere or putting them at risk of harm, I don't see any danger.
The People's Channel.
Right, good afternoon, Britain. It's 1 o'clock on Wednesday, the 17th of July. I'm Emily Carver.
And I'm Tom Harwood.
Now, today we saw Parliament in all its pomp and splendour as King Charles outlined the new government's plans in the King's speech. Adorned in all his royal regalia, the monarch read out priorities to MPs and members of the House of Lords, delivering the message of the first under the Labour government since 2009.
The first King's speech
Yes.
for the Labour government since in over 70 years. Well, housing was a big theme in the speech, of course, with the King outlining Labour's plans to get Britain building, pledging to reform planning processes and accelerate house building across the country.
And one of Labour's long-standing pledges, renationalising the railways. That was announced with bills to bring train operators into public ownership and the creation of a new dedicated public body. Great British Railways is to be brought in by the new Labour government.
Well, there's been a lot to digest, and it's not just the pomp and pageantry and getting to see the King in all his splendour, wearing his crown as he does fairly rarely, actually. When I think of a king, I sort of think he should be wearing the crown all the time, but that must be impractical.
I think they're rather heavy.
Yeah.
You'd get a bit of a pain in the neck, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But yes, a huge amount in there. Constitutional reforms.
A right royal pain in the neck.
A right royal pain in the neck. That is what you'd get if you wore a crown all day, every day. But lots in there. Lots on constitutional reform. No specific mention of the votes for 16s, but scrapping hereditary peers. Lots on devolution. House building. Say no to local outcries, local rebellions. No house building will go ahead under this Labour government.
But we're going to be speaking to the Education Secretary a little bit later in this programme to get the government's view on this mammoth group of bills, 40 pieces of legislation. Some revived from the last government that got lost in the dissolution of Parliament, others brand new. We also want your say. gbnews.com/your say is the way to get involved. But on to all of that and so much more after your headlines with Sam.
Tom and Emily, thank you very much indeed. It's just after 1 o'clock and the top story, as we've been covering today, the King has officially opened the new session of Parliament, setting out the government's planned programme of new laws. In total, 40 pieces of legislation were announced, more than the 35 expected, which includes plans to get Britain building, deliver greater devolution and enhance employment rights. The speech also proposed a football regulator, House of Lords reform and a plan to tackle organised immigration crime.
My government will seek to strengthen the border and make streets safer. A bill will be introduced to modernise the asylum and immigration system, establishing a new border security command and delivering enhanced counter-terror powers to tackle organised immigration crime. Legislation will be brought forward to strengthen community policing, give the police greater powers to deal with antisocial behaviour and strengthen support for victims.
The latest figures show that inflation held at the Bank of England's 2% target last month. All eyes now on the central bank and whether it will cut the interest rate this summer. The government says the data is welcome news, but prices are still high because of what they call economic chaos that was inherited from the Conservatives' government. Shadow Leader of the House of Commons, Chris Philp, accused Labour of shameless spin and suggested the party will introduce what he's calling sneaky tax rises.
This stuff that Rachel Reeves has been saying, claiming that the fiscal position is worse than she expected, is obvious nonsense. The OBR obviously assessed our fiscal position. They published their own forecasts a few months ago that she obviously saw. And we've seen today's inflation figure staying down at 2%, on target, lower than the Eurozone, lower than the USA, growth top of the G7.
The family of a 9-year-old girl who was shot in an East London restaurant shooting say she may never talk or walk again. Detectives have released new images of the prime suspect 49 days after a lone gunman on a motorbike opened fire on the building in Dalston. 3 men sitting outside were also hit in the gunfire, though they weren't seriously injured. However, the 9-year-old girl remains in a critical condition. It's feared that 2 British men reported missing in Sweden could have been killed. Police have now launched a double murder investigation there after 2 bodies were found in a burnt-out car in Malmö on Sunday. Local media reporting they were shot. Police are still working to identify the victims. And in Thailand, traces of cyanide have been found in cups of tea inside a hotel room where 6 people were found dead. Police say the 3 men and the 3 women were likely poisoned by one of those who died in the hotel room of the Grand Hyatt in Bangkok. That room was locked from the inside. Investigators say money may have been a motive after evidence showed financial investments had been made among those in the group. And here, Dame Priti Patel is reportedly entering the Conservative leadership race. The former Home Secretary is said to be assembling a campaign team funded by high-profile Tory donors, with The Telegraph saying a formal announcement is expected from her by the end of next week. It would be the first time she's put her hat in the ring after colleagues urged her to stand. So far, though, no other candidates have officially declared their plans. Those are the latest GB News headlines for now. I'm Sam Francis, back with you for more in half an hour.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Good afternoon, Britain. It is 6 minutes past 1, and we're going to cross straight to Westminster, where our political editor, Christopher Hope, is with the Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson.
Hi, Tom. Hi, Emily. I'm joined now by Bridget Phillipson, who's the Education Secretary. Bridget Phillipson, what did the PM mean when he talked about moving away from the snake oil charm of populism?
It's about putting politics back in public service, and what we demonstrated in our first days and week or so as a new government is our determination to deliver for the British people, and the measures that we've set out today, a really ambitious programme. People voted for change. We're going to get on and deliver that change.
You're the Education Secretary. The Children's Welfare Bill will limit the number of branded items on school uniforms. Why is that?
Because parents watching this will know that the cost of a school uniform has skyrocketed, and we don't think it's right that parents are facing such big costs. We think children can be smart in school, looking really great in school uniform, but it doesn't have to come at high cost. And that's also why we're taking action on breakfast clubs too, to make sure we've got universal free breakfast clubs in all of our primary schools to tackle those cost of living pressures that so many families have experienced.
If you look at the overall picture of these measures, about a quarter, I think the Tories could have done, Martin's Law and others. You are carrying over quite a few Tory bills, aren't you?
Well, for example, the measure that we intend to introduce in the bill around a register of children not in school, that was something that's been talked about for years. And there were various attempts to get that through the previous Parliament. We're acting where the Conservatives failed, but we're getting on with it. We know that there is a real urgency behind this because we have too many children. We don't have oversight of where they are. We want to make sure that all of our children are safe, well supported and happy.
I don't want to mention the B word, but I've got to. The word Brexit isn't mentioned in your 103 pages of background information about the King's speech. The EU, European Union, 15 times. Is Brexit a dirty word for your government?
No, I mean, as you know, within the King's speech, not every measure, not every action that a government will take is included within that. And we have been clear that we want to get a better deal. We don't think the deal that the Conservatives secured last time around should be the ceiling of what is possible. And we know that businesses are facing some barriers. We want to take those away and make sure that we've got a really strong and successful export market. But what we can do here alongside that and our plans on skills, creating Skills England, making sure we've got good training opportunities across our country, that's an important part of what we need to do as well.
Yeah, you haven't banned the word Brexit in government.
No, I mean, it's just about the practical measures that we want to take.
On the employment rights bill, small firms might worry about hiring someone who might go on to have sick pay, parental leave straight away. Is that an onerous imposition on small companies?
I think what we saw during the election campaign was that businesses were behind our agenda. We want to work with business, but we also want to make sure that we're delivering better rights at work. That we will, of course, make sure that we get these measures right. We want to work to implement them in a way that is responsible. But, you know, too many people in our country are in insecure work. They don't earn enough for the job that they're doing, and we are determined to make sure that people are better off.
Some do want, though, don't they, 0 hours contracts. Not everyone is against them. Will they allow to be on one if they want to be?
It's banning the end of exploitative 0 hours contracts. So we don't want people pushed permanently onto these kinds of contracts when what they want is the security of stable contract.
You've dropped the idea of banning peers over 80. Is that in the future? You're only getting rid of hereditary peers?
Well, once again, not everything can make that cut in terms of the speech. So we remain committed to the commitments of our manifesto on wider House of Lords reform.
And in the Northern Ireland legacy legislation, will that be easier to prosecute British troops now?
No, it's about making sure that we respond to the legacy of the past. The previous government's legislation in this area was deeply contentious, including in Northern Ireland, did not have support of the parties or communities there. We want to take a responsible approach and get this right, because there is still a legacy challenge there, and we want to make sure that the continued peace in Northern Ireland endures and continues into the future.
And you do pledge to publish draft legislation about ensuring that people of colour are paid the same as white people and those who are disabled as able-bodied people. When will that become law?
So it will be a draft bill that we set out, and there will be a process whereby we can look in detail at potential measures and make sure we're getting this right. But it is important to us as a party that we make sure that everyone across our country has a fair chance to succeed.
And the idea is to make companies publish how, if there's a race pay gap or a disability pay gap, publish that and justify it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about making sure we've got transparency, but take education as well. You know, we've seen a growing emergence of an attainment gap amongst better off children and their less affluent peers, and that absolutely has to change. We have to make progress on that too.
And just finally, the King's Speech does confirm the abolition of the VAT, imposing it back onto bills for private schools. Do you worry about your schools you're in charge of being flooded by private school children who can't be at private school anymore?
I mean, we rehearsed all of these arguments at length during the campaign, but what I'm determined to deliver is better state education where the vast majority of children go to school. I've never accepted the arguments that were put forward about the impact, and we've already got on with the job of delivering those 6,500 new teachers that this policy will pay for.
It might mean that some schools which look after disabled people do close, some of the more marginal private schools. That'll be on you, won't it?
Look, you know, we've seen it before. Some private schools closed their businesses, they made decisions, and some of those schools in recent years have faced challenges around numbers. That's for them to conclude. But actually what we're seeing across our school system in England is falling rules, falling pupil numbers, and that's creating different pressures. And this is the start of your government. The talking ends, you can stop blaming the Tories pretty soon and get on with it. Absolutely. I mean, we've been in opposition for 14 years. We don't want to waste a day. All of us who were appointed into government on that Friday got straight on with the job into our departments to deliver on what people voted for. We've got a mandate for change, but we know with that comes a big responsibility, and we want to demonstrate to the British people that the trust that they have placed in us, we are honouring and we're delivering. Is it radical enough for 14 years of waiting for this? Is it radical enough for you? Well, I've seen a lot of those speeches in my 14 years as a Member of Parliament, and that was very different, far more positive, ambitious, and I think will give our country some hope and optimism. Bridget Phillipson, thank you for joining us. And Bridget Phillipson talking over the noise of the council clearing up the horse dung behind us, but I hope you heard what you had to say.
We did indeed. Thank you very much, Christopher Hope, for bringing us that. It's a busy legislative agenda, isn't it? 40 bills. It's almost twice as many bills as the last Rishi Sunak King's Speech.
I thought there were only going to be 35, but no, there's the surprise. 40.
It's a real rabbit out of the hat,
bills.
Isn't it?
Yes, Labour know how to make the most of a majority, don't they, perhaps? Well, we shall see anyway. But Christopher Hope really creates a multi-sensorial experience for us. You can always smell it, the manure through the screen. So there you go.
I hope we can't smell it. But of course, this comes amidst an early scandal, perhaps, for this new government. Sue Gray, the new Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, has been accused of personally dominating meetings about specific bailouts for renovations of a Belfast sports stadium.
Yes, Miss Gray, who's known for conducting the official inquiry into Partygate, remember, has reportedly sparked resentment among ministers in negotiations about Casement Park, a disused ground which would host matches in the Euros 2028, which will be co-hosted by the UK and Ireland.
This, of course, comes in the context of restraint, spending restraint that many MPs are worried about in their own constituencies. But Sue Gray, who has a relationship to Ireland, she once owned a pub in Ireland, is now wanting to subsidise this stadium. Let's get the details with Doogie Beattie, our GB News reporter, who's outside Stormont in Belfast, because, Doogie, this is a bit of a scandal, is it not?
Well, it is, and that's why I'm outside Stormont and not outside Casement Park, because the politicians behind here that are unionist politicians are saying, crying foul, for want of a better word, saying, hold on a minute, we were all asked back in the early 2000s to look at a national stadium, and of course that national stadium was going to be in the Maze site. I was in many of those meetings with the Reverend Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness, who was then the Deputy First Minister, and what happened was the politicians couldn't agree amongst each each other. And the stadium on the site in the Maze was then halted. And the rugby got around about 50 to 70 million pounds to build their new stadium. Windsor Park got exactly the same. But in 2013, Casement Park, that was due to get exactly the same amount of money to rebuild that GAA ground, was stopped in a judicial review, mainly by the people that lived in that area, because it's like one of these old stadiums that doesn't, you know, there's no parking and access to it, so they wanted it built elsewhere. Now, since then, the bill has went up to an eye-watering £310 million to build this stadium, and it's being sold as a place for the Euros to be in 2028. But the problem with that, of course, is most people in that area do not support Northern Ireland, and in fact to get Northern Ireland supporters into that stadium, well, it would be quite a job, to be honest, because of where it's based. Now the GAA, I must say, I am a great supporter of the GAA. They're a fabulous organisation. They have encouraged sport and respect it amongst their people. They do great things in amongst their own community, but they are very much community based in one side. And the real row, and why I'm outside Stormont, is that public sector problems here with finance, etc. I mean, we have potholes in our roads. There's permanent strikes with doctors, nurses, much the way it is across the UK. And people are asking, well, who's going to pay the bill, the rates bill for this? Who's going to own the stadium afterwards? Who's going to take the profit out of it? And there doesn't seem to be any connection going either way with where that's going. And politicians here saying, well, if Sue Gray could put her foot in to Devolution Matters and ask for 310 million for one side of the community, well, the rest of the community are saying, well, where's our 240 million to come out of that? And would we not be better spending that on education, health, security, infrastructure, and at least if they were paying their rates, they'd be getting that back. Now, Simon Harris, the Taoiseach, is meeting today, I think it is, with Keir Starmer and Chequers, and there's no doubt at all that that will be discussed at that time, but also big problems around the legacy bill here, because, of course, it was a Labour government that gave out those letters of forgiveness and Queen's pardons of mercy to those that were killed here, that were in the security forces, and many here wanting to know, if Labour do away with the Legacy Act, is there going to be something put in place that those people that received those letters will now appear in court?
Really interesting, Doogie, that the Labour Party says there's no money for projects, no money for many MPs, but Sue Gray can find £310 million for a stadium in an area not favourable to unionists. She, of course, has a home in Northern Ireland. She ran a pub in Northern Ireland. She ran the finance department of Northern Ireland Devolved Matters between 2018 and 21. She's got an interest in this area, and suddenly she's finding the money for her own backyard.
Yes, that's exactly it. And politicians here are saying, well, if that's the case, why do we even bother having a budget? Because it'll be overruled by one person in London. And when the Labour government has just started and if they have said we want a very good relationship with the devolved institutions, it's not a good start.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Doogie Beattie, outside Stormont in Belfast for us. Yes, and she's not elected. She's a senior civil servant. She's now Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister. Should she be having these types of discussions anyway, in any case?
It's an interesting one, isn't it, about the power balance within Keir Starmer's top team. Who's pulling the strings, who's pulling the levers of power?
And, of course, there were so many questions over her appointment initially anyway. But turning back to the King's speech, as legislation to overhaul Britain's railways was included, which will bring train operators into public ownership, creating a new public body called Great British Railways to oversee the entire network.
Well, let's get the view of Jimbosco Nwogbo now, the lead campaigner at We Own It, a campaign group in favour of nationalising public services. Thank you for joining us. I suppose the first question is, will we actually see all that much difference, given how many railway lines are already nationalised?
Thank you very much for having us. I think we will begin to see some difference. It's useful for your audience to remember that when East Coast Rail was failing so dramatically some years ago when it was run by Virgin, the government stepped in, took it into public ownership. repaired it fundamentally, and made a profit of £1 billion the year after. So the government does know how to run trains. And what we're going to see is that with public ownership of the rail lines, we're going to be able to save £1.5 billion more per year that should be going out, or that would otherwise be going out in profits, or that is kind of as a result of waste, as a result of fragmentation. So I think it's going to fundamentally improve the service. Obviously, we think there are other things that the government should be doing alongside nationalization that would make even more of a difference, but this is a brilliant start.
John Bosco, many of our viewers and listeners are old enough to remember the days of British Rail, and they speak often of delays, inefficiencies, not a very good service. Why are you so sure that nationalising more of the railway system is going to dramatically improve the experience of people? Surely the trade unions will have more power, there could be more disruption, they're not necessarily going to have any cheaper fares. Why are you so sure that it's a good idea?
So there are so many things to respond to there. Number one is that obviously we don't need to go thinking about the 1970s when we can think about last year, the crisis that we had with TransPennine Express, Avanti, all of which are run by private companies. But I think that taking the rail into public ownership is in many ways the gold standard for running railway lines across the world. The best railway line in Europe is in Switzerland. It's 100% publicly owned and run. The reason why it works better in public ownership is, number one, you don't get profit leaving the system. By one estimate, we would be able to reduce rail fares if the government were, for example, to choose to invest the profits that would otherwise have been leaving into cutting rail fares. We would be able to reduce rail fares by 18%.
But John Bosco, you just cited the East Coast Main Line, the LNER service that is run by the government. It's no cheaper than any of the other lines. I rode it a couple of months ago and it was delayed, it was busy, it was cramped, it was no different from any of the private services people complain about.
The reason why that is the case at the moment is that you cannot achieve the advantages of public ownership by going a piecemeal approach. That's what we've always told the last government, and that's what we lobbied Labour for. You cannot achieve results, the kind of wholesale results that we're looking for by taking them piecemeal. You need to take the whole system. We also need to take the trains themselves. People don't actually know the changes that Labour is announcing today don't include ownership of the actual trains. We need to take the trains themselves into public ownership. That would save us £400 million that went out in profits last year that could be invested into improving the system. And I just wanted to add, reform voters who Labour will be looking to woo over the next 5 years massively support this proposal. They support it by around.
Yes, you're right. It's a very popular policy when people are polled. They do want to bring the railways back into national hands. Thank you very much, John Bosco and Nwogbo, the lead campaigner at We Own It.
I did start to hear the beginnings of some excuses there, though. That the reason that one of these lines that has been nationalised recently is still expensive and is still cramped and is still delayed, it's just not nationalised enough.
Yes.
I think that's what we're probably going to hear a lot over the next 4 or 5 years.
But coming up, moves to tackle the housing crisis. We're at the core of the new government's first King's Speech. We're going to break it all down for you after this short break. Stay with us.
Patrick Christie's Tonight, weekdays from 9 p.m.
Should Prince Harry have accepted an award named after a US war hero at a glitzy ceremony last night? People begged him not to, but he did it anyway. It's time for tonight's head-to-head. Well, Prince Harry paid tribute to the eternal bond between mother and son as he appeared alongside his wife, Meghan Markle, at the glitzy ESPY Awards, dubbed the Sporting Oscars last night. The Duke accepted the Pat Tillman Award, named after a US war hero, for his Invictus Games work. But Harry's decision to accept the award was shrouded in controversy after more than 76,000 people signed a petition demanding he reverse his decision. Well, speaking last night, Harry paid tribute to Pat Tillman's mother, Mary. But that comes after Mary Tillman slammed his decision to give Prince Harry the gong, saying, "I am shocked as to why they would select such a controversial and divisive individual to receive the award. There are recipients that are far more fitting. These individuals do not have the money, resources, connections or privilege that Prince Harry has." So tonight I'm asking, should Harry have actually accepted the award? Let me know your thoughts. Go to gbnews.com/your say. Tweet me at GBNews and make sure you take part in our poll. But going head-to-head on this now, a former royal butler, Grant Harold, and the journalist and broadcaster, Laurie Turner. Thank you very much. Great to have you both on the show. Laurie, I will start with you. I mean, the mother didn't want Harry to have it, but he did it anyway. What do you think?
I just think it's incredibly tone deaf. He seems to have an amazing ability to not read the room. It wasn't like this was a surprise because the opposition to him getting this award had been growing. So he had the chance to say, actually, I hear what you're saying. I'm not going to accept the award, but he didn't.
GB News, the People's Channel.
In the GB newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, GB News brings you accurate reporting of the day's topical agenda.
When the news breaks, wherever and whenever it's happening,
we'll be there.
This is GB News,
the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Christopher Hope. From pop stars to politicians, I'll interview anybody in a pub who's got a political opinion. Join me every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube or gbnews.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is GB News, the People's Channel.
If you want your news to be straight talking, this is a nightmare for the Conservatives again. Down to earth. It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it? And most importantly, honest. Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get their book thrown at them. They catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Well, good afternoon, Britain. It's 1:27 and locals now won't be able to block new housing. This is under new Labour plans.
Well, Keir Starmer has warned that his government will consult on how, not if, new developments should take place across local authorities, all part of his pledge to take the brakes off Britain.
Yes, new legal measures will force councils to quickly identify enough land to meet their predicted future needs, and local residents will be able to agree the style of new housing, but not object to it getting built.
Well, joining us now is the co-founder of the Community Planning Alliance, Rosie Pearson. Rosie, I'm going to hazard a guess that this is potentially not what you wanted to hear.
Well, no, but I mean, to start with, actually, it's a bit of a myth that communities can block housing in their area anyway. You have to have legitimate legal planning reasons if you want to say no to something, just as you have to have legitimate reasons to go ahead with the project. So it's a slight myth. I mean, it's good because Labour appears to be saying that communities must have involvement at the earliest stages of local plans, and it's really important that councils do have a local plan in place because that then does allow you to shape the future rather than being at the whims of developers, which is something we've seen too much in the past. If you don't have a local plan at the moment as a council, and if you don't have the housing targets achieved, then you have the presumption in favour of development, which allows developers to pretty much do what they want. So I'd say it's a bit of good and a bit of bad.
Yeah, so Rosie, do you think with all those caveats from the new government, this will actually hasten house building?
No, actually, I think that Labour is missing the point. They are setting targets which they say are obligatory for councils, but it's not councils who do the building, it's developers. We've seen even this week one of the major house builders saying that it will slow down its output, and that's because of mortgage rates and demand rather than planning. So if we want to actually solve the housing crisis, we need to look at who we're building for, and the main huge problem is the housing waiting list. And if you're on a housing waiting list, your hope of getting a council home is pretty dismal. And although Labour's talking about building for all tenures, which is good to hear, there's no funding that we've yet seen for social housing, and we really, really, really need a massive social housing programme so that we're dealing with the affordability crisis for the people that most need housing.
But Rosie, we've got the 4th highest level of social housing in the OECD. We've got lots and lots of social housing. The problem we have is that more people proportionally need to access that social housing than other countries because the market rate is so high. And I'd put it to you that actually the market rate shouldn't be as high as it is. Houses are so expensive because relative to demand, supply is constrained.
Well, I mean, we could probably sit here and have the supply argument, and I suspect we'd disagree, but there is little evidence to show that if you keep building endless houses, market houses, built by developers, that brings house prices down.
There's evidence from Auckland in New Zealand. There's evidence from Texas as well, from Austin, Texas, where they allowed building up and densifying the city, and rents, unlike every other city in the United States, have started falling, not climbing.
Well, there's arguments on both sides, and if you look at even the Kate Barker review, which was the sort of seminal report that everyone's relied on since 2004 in the UK, although she talked about supply, she did say that you would have to build a most extraordinary amount of housing to even make a dent on house prices. And actually, what's driving house prices at the moment is it's high mortgage rates which are controlling the supply. So if someone like Barratt, who's just announced this week they're going to slow their output, is not saying it's the planning system, they're saying it's the lack of demand and the mortgage rates, then that shows something different is going on. But anyway, whatever happens, we do need more social housing because the people on the housing waiting list will be sitting there indefinitely under Labour's proposals. And new towns is another thing that there may be a place for well-designed new towns. If done properly, and again, what I'm concerned about there is the lack of funding for them, because you cannot build a new town without putting the infrastructure in place first. So until we can see how that's going to be funded, then I have a suspicion of the New Towns project and how they'll be done. And what we will keep saying in the Community Planning Alliance is that you need to put the communities at the heart of development, and they should be shaping their futures, which Labour might be wanting to do. That's a good thing. We want to make sure the right things are in the right place. So that's affordable housing that's sustainable and well accessed by public transport and active travel, and that the environment is well protected. So I think all those three things no one could argue with. It's how we get there that I think is where some people differ.
Yes, I mean, last year the population grew by 610,000, though. I think it's getting into crisis territory with our housing. But thank you very much, Rosie Pearson from the Community Planning Alliance. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Yeah, goodness me. Well, we're going to have to get to...
I mean, I wouldn't have to have tons of housing dumped on my area if I was living in somewhere where I thought the infrastructure didn't meet that demand. But, I mean, with the population as it is, I mean, how can we not?
Yeah, no, I think it's really key that infrastructure is built alongside the housing. Hopefully, that's what these plans will have. As yet, we haven't seen all of the detail, but much more to come. Boris Johnson urges Donald Trump to continue aid to Ukraine should he win the US presidential race. But is it any of the former Prime Minister's business? Well, that's after your headlines with Sam.
1:33 and the top stories from the newsroom this afternoon. Well, the King has officially opened the new session of Parliament, setting out the government's planned programme of laws. In total, 40 pieces of legislation were announced. That's more than were expected. And they include plans to get Britain building, to deliver greater devolution and enhance employment rights. The speech also proposed a football regulator, House of Lords reforms and a plan to tackle organised immigration crime. Meanwhile, more than 30 protesters have been arrested in central London over plans to disrupt the state opening of Parliament. 10 members of the group Youth Demand were detained in Westminster, while another 20 to 25 protesters were arrested a short distance from the Houses of Parliament this afternoon. Police say they're now being questioned on suspicion of conspiracy to cause public nuisance. Police have released new images of a suspect wanted in connection with the shooting of a 9-year-old girl in East London. The gunman on a motorbike fired shots at a restaurant in Dalston on the 29th of May. The child's family say she remains in a critical condition and may never talk or walk again. 3 men sitting outside were also hit but weren't seriously injured. It's feared 2 British men reported missing in Sweden could have been killed. Police have launched a double murder investigation after 2 bodies were found in a burnt-out car in Malmö on Sunday. Local media there are reporting they were shot. Authorities are still trying to identify the victims. And the latest inflation figures show that they have held at the Bank of England's 2% target last month. All eyes now on the central bank and whether it will cut the interest rate this summer. The government says the data is welcome news, but added prices are still high because of the economic chaos they say they inherited from the Conservatives. Those are the latest GB News headlines. For now, I'm Sam Francis, back with you at 2 o'clock.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Cheers Britannia Wine Club proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
And here's a quick look at the markets for you this afternoon. The pound will buy you $1.3029 and €1.1915. The price of gold this hour, £1,898.64 per ounce. And the FTSE 100 is at 8,165 points.
Cheers Britannia Wine Club proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
Hello, welcome along to your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. A fine day out there and feeling quite warm. It's going to get a bit warmer as well over the next few days, certainly for some of us under the influence of this high pressure system. But notice there are weather fronts just creeping in towards the west. They'll bring a bit more cloud this afternoon to the west of Scotland, maybe 1 or 2 showers over the Highlands. But for most places, it's dry and fine. We had some early morning mist and some cloud is now developing. It's not blue sky everywhere, but generally sunny spells and a bit of sunshine will lift the temperatures up into the low to even mid-20s in the southeast. Could get up to 25 Celsius in the London area. A little cooler in the far northwest, and the cloud will continue to thicken across western Scotland as we go into the evening. Perhaps just a few more showers drifting in here, but for most of Scotland it is going to be a fine end to the day, with temperatures still 19-20 degrees at 5 o'clock this afternoon. Fine too in Belfast, but increasing cloud to the west of Northern Ireland. We will see a few showers just coming in here to end the day. For most of England and Wales, though, a pretty pleasant summer's evening. And it'll stay fine and dry across England and Wales overnight. But for Scotland and Northern Ireland, we will see that cloud continuing to thicken up. Outbreaks of rain trickling into Northern Ireland, certainly across western Scotland, where it could turn heavy in places towards the end of the night. Some mist and fog likely across parts of England and Wales, and maybe the odd shower into West Wales. But for most, dry. Quite a warm evening, but nothing too oppressive. 14 to 16 the low in most towns and cities. A wet start then for western Scotland on Thursday, so that rain could be heavy for a time in the morning. We'll see some showery rain across southern and eastern Scotland for a little bit of time through the middle part of the morning, and it's a dull, damp morning for Northern Ireland. But for most of England and Wales, it's another fine day, plenty of sunshine, and it is warming up as well, with temperatures maybe in the capital 28 degrees tomorrow.
The latest GB News travel.
Good afternoon to you. Hello, I'm Jules Buckley. South Lanarkshire, the southbound M73. Now the exit slip to come off at Maryville at junction 1 for the M74. It's closed off. There's an overturned vehicle there, so naturally causing queues. There's been a collision on the westbound M62 between Pontefract and Castleford. That's junction 32 to 31. So 2 out of 3 lanes are coned off that collision, causing delays. Now in Derbyshire, problems for the southbound A38. There was currently shut from junction 4 for the A50. That's Toyota Island in Eggington, down towards the Claymores Burton upon Trent turn off. Investigation work there for a previous bump. Queuing south down the M40 for half an hour, down to Bicester at junction 9. And in Kent, the eastbound M2 is closed from Stroud junction 2 to Rochester at junction 3, queuing due to a collision.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 39 minutes past 1. Now, the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has urged the former President, Donald Trump, to continue arming Ukraine during a 30-minute meeting at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee.
Yes, Boris Johnson has previously endorsed Donald Trump, but also has remained one of President Zelensky's most determined supporters during the war.
where we're joined now by media commentator and author of Reporting the War in Ukraine, Paul Connew. Because, Paul, this is an interesting, I suppose, difference. Lots of people are deeply critical of President Trump for suggesting that a quick deal should be cut to end the war in Ukraine. Boris Johnson has been seen as one of the most steadfast supporters of arming Ukraine to getting Russia out of that country. Could Boris Johnson actually have a bit of influence here?
I rather doubt it. Most of my Ukrainian contacts have long been living in fear of a second Trump presidency, and his pick of J.D. Vance as his running mate has only accentuated those fears. And Boris Johnson, I'm sure Boris Johnson, argued the case for supporting Ukraine at his meeting with Trump, but I doubt his influence is very great. And I think he's living in a false world of optimism by saying that he's confident that a second Trump presidency would support Ukraine. I think that the feeling pigs might fly, in fact, comes to mind there. And J.D. Vance has already made his view very, very
Hang
clear.
on, though. Donald Trump, when he was president last time, sent N-law missiles out to Ukraine. The former Ukrainian president met with Donald Trump, both of them businessmen. They sorted out a hell of a lot of military aid.
That was true, but since then, Trump has if you like, retreated on the Ukraine situation and has made it clear himself he thinks there should be a deal. I mean, he's boasted about, I could settle it in 24 hours. Well, in fact, the only way anything like that would happen is if Trump agreed to the idea of ceding the seized land in Ukraine, that Putin's already achieved, leaving it with him and having a situation where 20% thereabouts of Ukraine became part of Russia. And so far, President Zelensky is not entertaining that. What's interesting, though, where Boris Johnson might have some influence, is there are those, it was made clear yesterday, there were those, if you like, among traditional Republicans who don't favour abandoning Ukraine. But there were plenty of briefings yesterday from EU ministers that they fear that Ukraine would, and its hopes of joining NATO would go by the board if in fact Trump is re-elected. And of course, this morning in the King's speech, we actually had a firm commitment from the Starmer government to carry on supporting Ukraine. But it could be that it's Europe who have to really take the hard decisions on how much to support Ukraine if a Trump-Vance administration were to row back.
I mean, Paul, to play devil's advocate here, there's no end in sight to this war. Could it be that the vast majority of Americans want the next president to try their very best to put an end to it as quickly as possible?
I'm sure there are a lot of Americans who feel that way, but there are others who don't. And it's one issue that seems to split the Republican Party itself between, if you like, the more isolationist wing, and the more traditional Republicans. But at the moment, unless the polls are wrong, we are going to have, like it or not, a second Trump presidency. And there's no one I know in Ukraine, politically, journalistically, who doesn't feel that a Trump presidency is very bad news for Ukraine's prospects.
Well, Paul Connew, thank you so much for giving us that analysis, author of Reporting the War in Ukraine. Really appreciate your time.
Well, coming up, the government is set to tackle the prison overcrowding crisis by fast-tracking the removal of foreign inmates. We'll be diving into that after the break.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
A new report suggests that Prince Harry
is lonely in California, and he's considering returning to Britain despite a seismic falling out with his father and his brother.
But the question we're asking this morning is whether Meghan would come with her Prince Charming, or whether Harry would perhaps be more welcome here if he came solo.
Like Kinsey, we'll go to Kinsey Schofield live now in LA. Kinsey, we've got lots of time to talk about this and speculate this. We've got about 6 minutes or so to talk. But what's behind all of this? Where are these thoughts coming from?
They're coming from royal author Hugo Vickers, and I don't know if you're familiar with Mr. Vickers, but he's written over 30 books about the British royal family. And he told The Sun that Prince Harry will ultimately return to the UK with his tail between his legs. He described the Duke of Sussex as angry and says Harry is genuinely petrified of losing his wife, Meghan Markle. When asked his predictions for where Harry and Meghan will be in the next 20 years, Vickers told The Sun, I think he'll come home, explaining, I think Harry will come home, and if he comes home, we must be very nice to him because he won't particularly want to. He's quite angry, suggesting that he would be coming home solo. Vickers also said that Prince Harry looks slightly petrified of Meghan Markle and that King Charles has left the door wide open for Harry's return if and when he does decide to come back.
I can only imagine the culture shock that Prince Harry has faced arriving there. This is a kid that has grown up in castles.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Tune in to Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan. GB News royalty with your perfect start to the weekend. Lucky us. Feisty and fearless guests.
Well, I'm a normal person, so ask me.
Honest opinions that raises more questions than a Gary Barlow tax return. And a few surprises along the way. Might be cold in this studio. That is Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan. 8 to 9, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threat and so on.
As time passes,
She could have saved Storm.
You made my argument for me.
My guests and I tackle the issues that really matter with a sharp take on every story.
Went everywhere.
Something practical could be done.
Or I can become something different. Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 47 minutes past 1. Now, the government is trying to tackle this prison overcrowding crisis by fast-tracking the removal of foreign inmates.
Yes, so ministers are expected to announce plans to deport offenders from other countries more swiftly. Potentially, it could free up to 10,000 prison spaces.
Well, this move is part of a broader effort to prevent the criminal justice system reaching a breaking point. So who better to discuss this with than the barrister and writer Stephen Barrett. Stephen, I have to say, it was slightly music to my ears reading this, that instead of releasing people early, we might actually finally deport some foreign criminals.
Yes, well, we did have the first Rwanda scheme, which failed. We then had the second Rwanda scheme, and I said that was going to fail, and I still believe it was. This may well be music to people's ears, but the devil's going to be in the detail. Because let me give you a very simple example. If people remember the first Rwanda scheme failing, they might remember the word refoulement. And refoulement is woven through our laws on all of this. And unless you actually go through and pick that thread out, you're going to face legal challenge on the basis of refoulement. But then you're going to face legal challenge on the basis of human rights. You're going to face legal challenge on the basis of modern slavery. And it's been relatively hard to deport foreign criminals. The most success we've had is because we came to an agreement with Albania and we managed to get about 40% back. But even people who commit really serious offences, I saw a firearms offence earlier this year, and that wasn't enough to get them deported. Unless you change all the wiring, unless you fix the laws, this is not going to happen. It really doesn't matter what you say.
And are a lot of the obstacles international law, which we know Labour aren't going to want to remove us from? So is this just something to please the crowds but won't actually happen? I mean, how many times have we reported on people who've been foreign criminals and we haven't been able to deport them because of all this legislation? They get the best immigration lawyer involved, they get the best human rights lawyer involved, and they just end up staying here.
Yes, and you have to talk about culture as well, because there is a very strong cultural belief that deporting criminals is wrong. Now, I'm neutral. That's a political belief, so I'm not going to criticise that. But you have to recognise that it exists. Keir Starmer himself signed a letter 4 years ago trying to prevent the deportation of criminals. He presumably did that because he genuinely believed in it. David Lammy signed it too. Most of the lawyers working in this field, lots of them will be friends with Keir Starmer. Is there really the cultural and political commitment to this, or are we setting up the legal system to fail? Because that's the one that concerns me. Because if there's a deep political will amongst the people, but not amongst the elite, and if we keep throwing this issue against the legal system, and it starts to look like the judges are blocking the will of the people, that's not a very healthy position to be. Now, that won't be the genuine position, because it will simply be that the legal system hasn't been fixed to allow this. You can fix the legal system to allow this, but unless you're going to do it, this was just going to fail.
I know Keir Starmer, when he was chief prosecutor, was quite proud of his rights, or his record on human rights, whereby he would treat everyone that he was prosecuting with the utmost sort of respect. And his argument is therefore the cases against these people are watertight. If you say we're not going to deport these people to a country with the death penalty, if you say we're going to give them the best possible care, give them the best possible lawyers, you then have a completely watertight case if something is found against them. There's no room for appeal. What do you make of that argument?
Well, again, I doubt it will matter when it comes crashing against the system we have. Emily's question was also very good, and I should have addressed that more directly. It's international law and it's domestic law. Both of them are currently woven. Maybe I'll use that. I don't know if that's a tortured metaphor. I hope it helps your viewers. But they're currently woven to stop this happening, to stop deportation. They work very strongly to prevent it. Unless you reweave it to allow this to pass through the net, then it's just going to get blocked again. And that's really my concern, that we will bring the legal system into disrepute if for the third time the public see us effectively blocking something that they want to happen.
I mean, Stephen, this sounds like it might be an example of snake oil populism, if it actually can't be done without taking us out of all of these legal issues. But thank you very much, Stephen Barrett, barrister and writer. Always fabulous to speak to you. Good stuff. Right, now I believe we are going to speak to Matt Vickers, the Conservative MP, returning to, of course, the opening of Parliament. You are the MP for Stockton West. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Matt. I mean, the Labour government, they've hit the ground running. 40 bills.
Yeah, well, plenty of spending commitments in there, which is what we always expect. It smells like a Labour government. It looks like a Labour government. It's going to spend lots of money its usual way, and then we'll pick up the tab later, and the taxpayer will pick up the tab later. Lots of ambitious things to be done. Lots of questions to be asked. We're a government now. Well, we're a party in opposition who are not going to be in opposition for opposition's sake. We're going to scrutinise what comes forwards, ask the right questions and make sure that we deliver the results for the British people.
Yeah, Matt, it's doing all of these terribly left-wing things. It wants to set up a football regulator, it wants to iteratively ban smoking so adults can't smoke, and it wants to have a duty against terrorism on even small hospitality businesses. A Conservative government would never do those three things now, would it?
Well, there's lots of devil in the detail, isn't there? Lots of headlines to be had, but lots of devil in the detail as to what those things look like in practice, whether those terrorism efforts do impact on small hospitality businesses or whether they don't. And those are the questions that we're going to be asking.
Matt, you know why I'll put the question there? Because these were all things that the previous government, the government which you served, the government that you were a Member of Parliament supporting, was trying to do as well.
Do you know what? I think there's lots of things there, but it is about the detail. It is about what the implication of some of these things are. I don't think any of us will argue that smoking is bad for the health of young people and we should be doing something to try and control the growth in the number of vapes. I don't think anybody would oppose lots of those things, but it's all about the detail. It's all about the implications and the effect on people. I think lots of people at home today would be looking at the country. Do you know what? The economy is in a much better shape than it was. There's lots of opportunities available to us. Inflation's down. We're now the fastest growing economy in the G7. Things are moving the right way. There are opportunities now as to what happens next. And that's what we're going to see. But we've got a Labour government in there that only got 34%.
Now, Matt Vickers, it is, of course...
and it looks like it's going to spend a lot...
It's, of course, your job now, the Conservative Party, to provide the opposition to this agenda. At the moment, lots of whispers about who might be the next leader of the Conservative Party. Who do you get behind?
You know what? The betting's still on, the options are still open, and I'm considering all of them and looking what they might offer us as we try to take this country forward and offer an alternative. I'm sure it should be a wonderful option, but I'm sure there's lots of wonderful options, but I haven't made a decision yet, and I'll be weighing up those options in the days, weeks and even months possibly to come.
Now, of course, you were one of the few Conservative MPs, one of the minority of Conservative MPs who kept their seats at the election. You were talking about the positive economic news, the growth figures, the low inflation. Did the Prime Minister simply call the last Prime Minister call this election too early?
Well, do you know what? I'm sure we will talk about that for years to come. We'll talk about whether it was too early, too late even, whether it should have gone in May. But actually what we've got to look at is that the country is in a good state in terms of its economy. That growth is the fastest growing economy in the G7. You need to keep talking about this, Tom. But there's also lots of things that we came away from the doorsteps with, challenges that the government face that we're going to have to make sure we get on with as we move forward, whether that be immigration, whether that be around what we do in our communities. You know, we've heard the government talking about devolution max, throwing all these powers to local people, but at the same time trying to take away local people's say in what happens in their communities in terms of planning. Lots of big issues as we go forward. Those are the issues I've been talking about to people on the doorsteps, and those are the issues I'm going to be talking about in the next few months as we move forward.
OK, well, thank you very much indeed, Matt Vickers, a Member of Parliament for Stockton West. Good to speak to you.
Yeah, one of the 121 Conservative MPs who still remain on those green benches. Lots more to come as the next hour. We're going to be crossing to the House of Commons. MPs are gathering in there. We're going to hear not only from the Prime Minister, but the Leader of the Opposition as well.
It's our summer treat to you. Your chance to win an incredible £30,000 in tax-free cash. Our biggest cash prize of the year so far. With an extra £30,000 in your bank account this year, you could take the ultimate financial holiday and send some of those day-to-day financial stresses packing. £30,000 could get you those nagging home improvements done, buy that brand new car, or just enable you to kick back and relax for the rest of the year. For another chance to win £30,000 in tax-free cash, text cash to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. You can enter online at gbnews.com/win. Entries cost £2. Or post your name and number to GB07 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrants must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 30th of August. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Join me, Nana Akwe, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
It's true. You're not wrong. No one will be cancelled.
Lovely. Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Neil Oliver, every Sunday night at 6 p.m. on GB News. And if an hour is not nearly enough for you, go to gbnews.com for special extended episodes online every Friday at 9 p.m, where we can truly get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on. GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every Saturday, 10 till 12, we'll bring you all of the news that you need to know. We'll also remind you that there is so much to smile about.
It's my favourite time of the week. I get to relax, enjoy some light-hearted stories, and let Ellie teach me about fashion too.
That's Saturday Morning Live, every Saturday, 10 till 12.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats in the bomb threat zone.
As time passes,
She could have said stump.
you made my argument for me.
One at a time. My guests and I tackle the issues that really matter with a sharp take on every story.
Went everywhere.
Something practical could be done.
Or I can become something different.
Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Stephen Dixon, and thanks for joining us on GB News, Britain's news channel.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, and as you know, we always love to hear your views. Now, there's a new way of getting in touch with us at gbnews.com/yoursay. By commenting, you can be part of a live conversation and join our GB News community. You can even talk to me, Bev Turner, or any of the members of the GB News family.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 2 o'clock on Wednesday, the 17th of July. I'm Tom Harwood.
And I'm Emily Carver.
Today, we saw Parliament in all its pomp and splendour as King Charles outlined the government's plans in the King's Speech. Adorned in all his royal regalia, the monarch read out the priorities to MPs and members of the House of Lords. A debate will commence within 30 minutes.
Yes, indeed. And housing, of course, was a big theme in the speech. The King outlining Labour's plans to get Britain building, pledging to reform planning procedures and accelerate that house building across the country.
And one of Labour's long-standing pledges of renationalising more of the railways was announced, with bills to bring train operators back into state ownership and the creation of a new dedicated public body. Great British Railways is to be brought in by the new Labour government.
Right, well, we want to know what you make of the King's Speech. I mean, it's hard to cover absolutely everything in there in totality, but perhaps there's something that stuck out to you. I think more powers to workers, more powers to the trade unions, more powers to renters.
And more powers to local mayors.
And more powers to local mayors, which, you know, I've got a view on. Constitutional reform, there was no explicit mention of votes for 16s, but scrapping those hereditary peers, does that make you sad? Does that make you happy and joyful?
We're going to be speaking to experts throughout the programme, picking up on some of the details within what was said, but also bring you that debate in the House of Commons as Parliament begins several days now of debating the premise of these 40 new bills brought before Parliament. We want your views throughout it, of course. Post your comments by visiting gbnews.com/yoursay.
But it's your headlines now with Sam Francis.
Tom, Emily, thank you very much, and good afternoon to you. It's just after 2 o'clock, and as we were hearing there, the top story today, the King has officially opened the new session of Parliament, setting out the government's planned programme of new laws. In total, 40 pieces of legislation were announced, more than 35 expected, which included plans to get Britain building, deliver greater devolution and enhance employment rights. And the speech also proposed a football regulator, House of Lords reform, and a plan to tackle organised immigration crime.
My government will seek to strengthen the border and make streets safer. A bill will be introduced to modernise the asylum and immigration system, establishing a new border security command and delivering enhanced counter-terror powers to tackle organised immigration crime. Legislation will be brought forward to strengthen community policing, give the police greater powers to deal with antisocial behaviour, and strengthen support for victims.
The latest figures show inflation held at the Bank of England's 2% target last month. All eyes will now be on the central bank and whether it will cut the interest rate this summer. The government says the data is welcome news, but prices are still high because of the economic chaos they say they inherited from the Conservatives. Well, Shadow Leader of the House of Commons, Chris Philp, told us that Labour are shamelessly spinning and suggested the party will introduce what he's called sneaky tax rises.
This stuff that Rachel Reeves has been saying, claiming that the fiscal position is worse than she expected, is obvious nonsense. The OBR obviously assessed our fiscal position. They published their own forecasts a few months ago that she obviously saw. And we've seen today's inflation figure staying down at 2%, on target, lower than the Eurozone, lower than the USA, growth top of the G7.
The family of a 9-year-old girl who was shot in East London say that she may never talk or walk again. Detectives have released new images of the prime suspect 49 days after a lone gunman on a motorbike opened-fired on a restaurant in Dalston. 3 men sitting outside were hit by that gunfire but weren't seriously injured, though the 9-year-old girl does remain in a critical condition. A former Army general has admitted disgraceful conduct of an indecent kind after being accused of sexual assault. James Roddice pleaded guilty to the lesser charge at Bulford Military Court in Salisbury. The court was told the complainant indicated she was content with the court. Roddice was made an MBE and also earned 2 Queen's Commendations for his service in the military. He'll be sentenced in September. It's feared the 2 British men reported missing in Sweden could have been killed. Police have launched a double murder investigation there after 2 bodies were found in a burnt-out car in Malmö on Sunday. Local media is reporting that they were shot, but police are still working to identify the victims. In Thailand, traces of cyanide have been found in teacups inside a hotel room where 6 people were found dead in Bangkok. Police say the 3 men and 3 women were likely poisoned by one of those who died in the room of the Grand Hyatt Hotel, which was locked from the inside. Investigators say that money may have been a motive after evidence showed financial investments had been made among the group. And in the last hour or so, we've heard that prisoners of war have been exchanged following an agreement between Ukraine and Russia. 95 soldiers from each side were returned, the Ukrainian men appearing emotional as they left a bus, finally on home soil. If you're watching on TV, you can see there those images as the men exited the bus and showed some very desperate scenes of emotion as they arrived back on Ukrainian soil. President Volodymyr Zelensky saying all of those freed were from armed forces and thanked the UAE for its help in facilitating the deal. Those are the latest GB News headlines for now. I'm Sam Francis. Another update at 2:30.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 6 minutes past 2. Now, before we delve into the King's speech and look ahead to that debate in the next 20 minutes or so, it's worth mentioning that some young protesters from the group Youth Demand have been arrested in central London over plans to disrupt the state opening of Parliament.
Well, let's get more with our Home and Security editor, Mark White. What is Youth Demand and how far did they get?
Well, it's an offshoot activist group, an offshoot of Just Stop Oil and other activist groups for the environment, along with pro-Palestinian activist groups. They've all come together with the set aim of trying to highlight the issues around the environment, but also around what is happening in Gaza at the moment. And they, a week ago, had threatened to disrupt the state opening of Parliament. So the police, acting on intelligence and spotting a number of these activists, moved in to arrest them preemptively. So 10 people were arrested, first of all, in the Westminster area about 9 a.m. this morning. Then about an hour after that, before the actual procession to the Houses of Parliament had taken place, another 20 to 25 activists were surrounded by police officers in Victoria Gardens on Victoria Embankment, a short distance from the Houses of Parliament. They were contained there for a while, and then the police moved in, picked them off one by one, arrested them. They're all in police custody at the moment, arrested on suspicion of planning to create a public nuisance. The police will do this from time to time. If they have got solid evidence that a crime may be about to be committed, they can move in preemptively, as they have done on this occasion, to stop whatever this group was planning, because it's not uncommon for these activist groups to try to cause disruptions, such as jumping out in front of vehicles. They've done it with political leaders being escorted around central London before, and even royal cavalcades in the past have also been the subject of disruption. So the police taking no chances here, especially in light of what happened in the US at the weekend there. There is always an underlying threat to life at these big public events here in the UK as well. So the police taking no chances, moving in, preemptively arresting more than 30 of these activists.
No, it's unusual that we see such wide-scale arrests at a time like this. But of course, I suppose there were threats from this particular group that were made public before this royal occasion. Mark White, thank you so much for bringing us the very latest on that security element of today's big state opening.
Yes, I imagine the pro-Palestinian contingent of protesters will be very loud with this new government. I mean, listening out for the Middle East in the King's speech, there was a commitment to a two-state solution, but I imagine any government of any colour would make that same commitment. There's nothing there on, arms sales or on anything like that. So there you go.
No, and of course we haven't controlled Israel since the late 1940s, so not sure what good it will do anyway. Anyway, members of Parliament will reassemble in the House of Commons to begin debating the King's speech in just some minutes' time.
Yes, His Majesty read out 40 draft laws, including plans to nationalise the railways, house building programmes and the economy.
Well, the government says its legislative agenda will take the brakes off Britain and counter the snake oil charm of populism.
Well, we're joined now by former Conservative MP Miriam Cates and former Labour advisor Matthew Larser. Miriam, how do you feel? 40 bills read out. We were expecting 35, but no, 40 were squeezed into that King's speech. This is going to be a busy new government.
It sure is, and it's certainly not a populist King's speech, looking at some of the measures being drawn out. Now, there are a few things in there that I do think are a good idea. For example, a bill to help people consolidate their pension pots. Lots of people now work for a number of companies over their working lives. I think that's very, very sensible, very practical. I think another good measure is to scrap the £200 limit for shoplifting to be investigated. Certainly, there has been a rise in shoplifting, and one of the problems is that police have not been investigating any thefts of under £200. So again, I think that's a very sensible measure. But there are things in this King's speech that I think are very unsensible measures. I could speak for a long time on that, but I think one thing to highlight would be this budget responsibility bill, which would essentially give the OBR power to scrap a government budget. So an elected government, elected by the people, that brings forward a budget to, let's say, cut taxes, or let's say make a huge investment in the future, or change the way our tax system works, could actually be overruled by an unelected body, the OBR. And I think that's really taking away from the sovereignty of Parliament and effectively the power of the people. I think that's very, very worrying. But I could go on. There's many, many things in there that are either meddling or actually causing serious problems.
I'm glad you touched on that, because we hadn't given it enough attention yet, because handing that power to the OBR, Matthew, that's quite a big commitment that may have, consequences for years, generations to come.
Well, it's not handing the power to veto a budget to the OBR. It's ensuring that the OBR look at every budget before it's delivered.
Run it by.
Yeah, well, I mean, and they can raise points, and it's up to the elected government or not to overrule those points. In some ways, it'd be better than what happened under Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, where the budget happened. The OBR basically briefed the briefing anyway, and it would have been better to say, we hear you, this is the reason we're doing it, we're going to go ahead anyway. So I don't think it's giving away elected power, but it's ensuring scrutiny. Remember, the OBR was a creation of the man who was Foreign Secretary till 10 days ago, David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, and George Osborne.
Are the OBR not are they infallible?
No, they're not infallible, and that's why I think it's right that they take a look at it, but it's also right that a government can say, well, thank you for looking at it, we're going to go ahead with this anyway, because this is a political priority.
But the problem is, as we saw in the Liz Truss debacle, the OBR does have enormous power, or certainly enormous influence, and it'd be very difficult to see an elected government being able to get away with producing a budget that the OBR disapproved of, particularly by entrenching their power in this way. And actually, the OBR does not have a great record when it comes to forecasting. They're very often wrong, and so it seems to me that actually the ultimate power and authority should stand with the people, which is Parliament, and not an unelected quango. And I think actually the OBR was a bad invention.
It's an interesting point you raise, Miriam, because of course many battles were had 2015, 2016, and then right through until the 2019 general election, when you were elected, over that fundamental issue of the sovereignty of Parliament. Where does power lie? And it's not just with the OBR, Matthew, but it's also with devolved assemblies. It's also with extra powers for trade unions. Of course, big battles in the 1970s over who...
Yeah, I don't think that the measures today amount to return to the 1970s.
But of course, there is a discussion here over where does power sit in Britain, and that could be a big theme of the next 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think that mayors are going to be quite a big issue, because I think there's two things. One, I think that the mayors, the Labour mayors, are going to be effectively the real opposition, because they have these fiefdoms. They're also, outside of London, where there is an assembly, they're also basically unscrutinised, because they just basically are scrutinised by the leaders of the local councils. Now, you know, in Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham's the mayor. That's normally 11, occasionally 12 out of 12. Sorry, 9 out of... yeah, anyway, it's almost all of them. You know, and the same goes in other parts of the country. So you basically get one-party states. Yeah. And also, of course, what happens is the leaders of the local councils are all given jobs. They're all the deputy mayor for this or the lead on that. So it's not exactly like having a robust, even a council chamber against them. So I think, yes, we need to give the mayors certain powers. We're giving powers on buses, for example, beyond the metro mayors. It's already happening in places like Manchester.
They're always going to want more, though, aren't they, Matthew?
Yes.
We've seen that with devolution.
We've seen that in Scotland.
We're supposed to strengthen the union, and what's happened instead?
Well, look, every time I hear the phrase Devo Max, a shiver goes down my spine, because it takes me back to the eve of the Scottish referendum, where that was the promise in return for voting no in Scotland. It was, I think, with a covenant with the Scottish people on the front of the Daily Record. And, you know, I think there has to be a limit. I think the government needs to be careful that in the first days where it seems nice, you know, have the jolly selfie outside Downing Street with the mayors, even being nice to the sole Tory Ben Houchen getting his in the selfie. Yeah. It's just that, you know, nice, warm words, but actually, as you say, look at the detail of how it's going to operate.
Miriam, do we want second-rate politicians in this country to have more power concentrated in their hands?
I don't think it's necessarily that they're second-rate.
I'm not talking about any
individual. I think it's that the model is completely wrong, and I support devolution in principle. I think that decisions should be taken as close as possible to the people they affect. But the problem with the model that we have now is essentially the mayors are just an additional level of bureaucracy, and they don't have tax-raising powers, which most people would probably think is a good thing.
Or indeed tax-cutting powers.
But they don't have tax-cutting powers, so they can go to Westminster and say, we want more money, and if the government says, no, there is no more money, they can go back to their electorate and blame the government. Now, that's worked well for Labour mayors under a Conservative government, because they have blamed Conservatives and austerity for bad buses, etc., etc. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens next, because there isn't any more money.
The Labour-run councils,
and yet suddenly the Labour mayors are not going to be able to blame it on the government, or if they do, they're very quickly going to lose support.
This could be where more powers for local mayors is actually a very good thing for growth in the country. Currently, if there's a local authority or a local mayor who says, I don't want this to be built here, I don't want that new power station or whatever it is, this new business doing economic activity, well, if they approve it, they don't get any of the benefits. They can't sort of, other than business rates, they don't collect any of the extra economic activity, any of the siphoning off. Yeah. That doesn't happen. If they were able to get revenue from things that they approve, that could generate more economic activity.
It could, and that's the kind of model that could work better, because you have power and accountability. But the problem we have in Britain is that we're such an imbalanced economy, and we're the most imbalanced economy in Western Europe. And actually, you'd probably find that the vast majority of the metro mayors, certainly in South Yorkshire, are actually starting from such a disadvantageous point in terms of the amount of business revenue, the kind of entrepreneurial headquarters and things like that you have, but they would never, ever catch up. And, you know, whilst as a Conservative I hesitate to say what we need is state intervention, actually, in some of these areas, what we do need is state intervention, because outside of London and the South East, all of our regions are actually dependent on the wealth created in the capital, and that's a very difficult place for these mayors to start from.
Miriam, another area that we haven't spoken about, and it only got a quick mention in the King's speech, is this ban on conversion practices. And this relates more so to transgender people, children mostly, I presume. And this is a bit of a controversial one. I'm not sure many people really understand what this is all about. The idea of conversion practices sounds awful, sounds medieval. Almost. But this could be worrying.
Yes, and, you know, you're right. Some of the ideas that people will have of what this means are actually, of course, appalling, but are already illegal. You know, anything coercive or violent is already illegal and covered by numerous other bills. But the problem with trying to stop somebody from preventing, let's say, a child from pursuing their gender identity, so let's say you've got a girl and she thinks that she's been born in the wrong body and she wants to be a boy, a bill like this could potentially make it illegal for a teacher or a counsellor to say to that girl, no, actually, you're not a boy. We're not going to let you go down the route of hormonal therapy or medical treatment. We're going to watch and wait and hope that, you know, you grow out of it or that you realise this is not a good decision. Now, obviously, that's an extreme challenge, not only to free speech, but parental rights, to prevent a parent from protecting their child from gender ideology. And what makes this position from Labour such a nonsense is that just yesterday, Wes Streeting has said that he will continue the ban that the Conservatives put in place on puberty blockers for children. So the government is preventing children from pursuing gender identity, and yet at the same time they want to bring in a bill that will criminalise people from preventing a child from pursuing their gender identity. It's a nonsense. But what's really interesting is that they've only committed to bring in a draft bill. And every draft bill we've seen so far, there have been 2 so far in Parliament this year, have been thrown out because it's been proven so difficult to legislate in this area. So I don't think it's necessarily guaranteed that it will happen.
That's interesting. Let's throw that dichotomy over to Matthew Larser, because there does seem to be the government talking through 2 sides of its mouth on this issue. On the one hand, Wes Streeting saying no more puberty blockers for children. On the other hand, this conversion ban.
Well, no, absolutely not, because the briefing of the ban is quite clear that the new draft bill will respect the legitimate psychological support, treatment or non-directive counselling, and respect the important role that parents, teachers, religious leaders and carers have in supporting those exploring both their sexual orientation or their gender identity. So I think that, you know, it is important those caveats are in there. It's important that the lessons of the Cass Review are learned, but it's also important that we ban the horrific practice of conversion therapy, which it is appalling is still legal in our country.
I guess it's difficult to know exactly what they mean by conversion practices, because if it's something that's violent or physically abusive, then of course that is already illegal, you'd hope, under
Emily, I mean,
whereas therapy is where it gets all vague, because is therapy someone saying, you know, not affirming their new gender identity?
It's not. I remember the vast majority of people that have been subject to conversion therapy have not been people questioning their gender. They've been people questioning their sexual orientation, and they've been, and you know, this is a bill that, you know, will mostly provide an issue as your sexual orientation, and the sort of, you know, ex-gay movement, the kind of trying to exercise.
Look,
I mean, even if it's one person, it's one person too many. But yes, it's more widespread than you think. I mean, you look online at the number of covert filming.
2 bills have already been thrown out of Parliament this year, 2 private members' bills, one in the Commons, one in the Lords. The problem is there is no legal definition of gender identity or transgender, and there can't be, because unlike sexuality, gender identity is an idea. You can't prove whether somebody feels male or female. It's just not something that you can define in law.
True also of sexual orientation. We haven't discovered a gay gene. We can't sort of look at anything physiological about someone.
But the thing about gender identity is that people who subscribe to this idea, they want other people to affirm them in that gender identity. So it's part of the whole the ideology that other people agree that you've actually now become a woman. Whereas, of course, that's not the same with sexual orientation. You have a sexual orientation, regardless of whether anybody else knows about it, agrees with it, whatever. Gender identity is something entirely different. You can't define it in law. And what the bills that have come before Parliament have tried to do is actually create these circular definitions, and they've tried to create safeguards for parents. But the most recent one was parents are protected from this ban on conversion therapy unless they're practising conversion therapy. Now, that's, again, a circular definition. So the Government Equality Officers spent 2 years trying to come up with the form of words. 2 private members have tried to do it. They've all failed. I don't think it's possible.
Well, goodness me, much more to come on this programme. Of course, we've only just scratched the surface of what is in the King's speech. Many politically contentious issues to come. We're going to hearing from our political editor ahead of the Prime Minister the Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and indeed the Leader of the Opposition, Rishi Sunak. Getting important to learn that way around.
We're going to be debating the King's speech up next.
Martin Daubney. Weekdays from 3 p.m.
King Charles has launched his own aftershave, costing, wait for it, an eye-watering 135 quid for a 100 millilitre bottle, promising buyers that they can smell just like the gardens of his Highgrove country pile. Now, this is something that Meghan Markle would do, surely not the King. Is this a case of King Charles selling out, watering down the brand just like Meghan? Well, join me now to discuss this is the royal broadcaster Helena Chard. Helena, welcome to the show.
Martin,
often on this
hi.
show, we've had a pop at Meghan Markle, the Sussexers, for selling out, for flogging strawberry jam, and now the King is flogging Pong. Is this really the right royal thing to do?
Do you know what? So the joy of luxury Highgrove splash, you know, at the end of the day, Highgrove is such a special place, and the Highgrove shop sells amazing things on there. And as we know, the profit actually goes towards charity. So it's the King's Foundation, which was formed in 1986. Profits go towards educational and training, and it's all to do with this sort of sustainable world. But not to forget as well the charitable aspect and the whole ethos of the King's Foundation, and that's so important. This is not just something that's going up on the website and just being sold purely to go into someone's pocket. So I think, you know, all in all, I think everyone should have a look at the Highgrove website and see what's on for sale. I mean, there are lots of really lovely, I think pretty fairly priced products, and even more so, go and see the gardens. You know, as we know, King Charles is a keen environmentalist, and the gardens are fabulous.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the argument. We get rid of the disrespect, and then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together, and what have we got? In my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, for a frank and honest discussion with those in power that cuts through the spin and gets to the heart of the issues shaping our nation.
You haven't confirmed that you want to stand as leader, but you haven't ruled it out either.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial. Is he indecisive? Incompetent? I deliver the dose of reality Westminster needs. That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, good afternoon, Britain. It's been a busy show today, and very shortly we're going to be crossing to the House of Commons, where a debate will take place, of course, in relation to the King's speech. Let's cross straight to our political editor, Christopher Hope, who is in Westminster for us. Christopher, what can we expect?
Well, we'll see for the first time, won't we, Rishi Sunak taking on, as leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer on his plan for government. And I wonder what he'll try and attack on. About a quarter of the bills, by my reckoning, are the kind of things a Tory government would pursue. But there's elements around the edges there, which there's a chance here for the Tories to try and get an early blow on this Labour government, notably about these rules, these new laws allowing people arriving for work on day one to claim immediate sickness benefit and immediate maternity and paternity rights, things which small companies might object to. Also, I think the Veterans Bill, I've been talking to someone over lunch about this Northern Ireland legacy legislation. It's basically going to restart prosecutions of veterans in Northern Ireland who are accused of being involved in deaths and the like. And I wonder if that could be a big problem here. This government is quite weak on the whole area of veterans, and so many voters, of course, have served in the armed forces. We saw them take away that role from the cabinet Johnny Mercer had in the cabinet office, giving it to a new commissioner. But the fact they're going to restart prosecutions in Northern Ireland, which is what could happen, I think, from repealing the legislation on legacy passed by the last Tory government, could be a problem for them. I think elsewhere we're going to see elements of why they've watered down their plans on dealing with the oversized House of Lords. Will the over 80s be banned or not? And the idea of this attack on populism, snake oil charm of populism, I don't think really that's where Rishi Sunak sat in politics. So that was more a jibe aimed at Liz Truss and probably Boris Johnson. So what will Mr Sunak say about that? But it's a change of tone for him. We've seen him before as a governing Prime Minister. Now, is he any good as an attack dog leader of the opposition?
Well, Christopher Hope, thank you very much. It's just 2 minutes' time, perhaps less, when we'll be crossing to the House of Commons, but we've got time for a quick bit of analysis in the studio with us. So let's turn to Miriam Cates first of all. How should Rishi Sunak play this?
Well, obviously, it's very difficult for him. It's a huge role reversal. And clearly, the Conservative government made huge mistakes, which they're now paying for. So he's going to have to be careful not to attack on things that the Conservative government either promised and didn't deliver or supported at the time. So obviously, he's not going to go on the smoking ban, which is his idea, and some of the sensible ones about policing. But I think he should go on the proposed race equality bill, because I think that will be very, very divisive and very difficult to police. And also some of the things that are clearly going to harm small business but let big business get away scot-free, like the new worker rights.
And how does Sir Keir Starmer play this?
Well, I mean, it plays to his strengths, which is very straight. And the line they want to emphasise, there are no surprises here. This is the manifesto, you know, turned into a King's speech. This is, you know, delivering what we promised, very straight down the line, you know, managerial government, which is what they want to emphasise.
Matthew, I do want to just say a sea of red on the government bench is unusual, apart from one Angela Rayner, who's in a blue dress. What on earth is the symbolism?
Bipartisanship, you know, showing she's governing for the whole of the country.
Didn't get the memo, did she?
We should say what is taking place right now is that members of Parliament are taking the oath of office. They're swearing or affirming. There's Sir Geoffrey Cox, who will be swearing in rather than affirming. He's got a copy of the Bible there, just while we wait for that to...
So I must be close to finishing that.
Well, I mean, 150 odd to get through.
I don't know if it was the same when Miriam was sworn in, but apparently you can now swear in Cornish, as long as you do English first and Cornish second, whereas if you do Welsh, you do Welsh first and English second, because there's slightly different status of the languages. But apparently the new Labour MPs in Cornwall did it in Cornish, I was told this week,
Goodness me, but also there's a plethora of religious books that you can swear in on now, or indeed no religion at all.
It's very inclusive,
One MP does it on 7 different books. Apparently you can choose more than one.
Wow, that's really hedging your bets, isn't it?
How do you hold 7 books up like
I don't know. I mean, my leg may have been pulled, but Bob Blackman did it on the Hindu text and on the Bible.
That's interesting. Well, I think people are hedging their bets or doing it for social media. But when I was elected in December 2019, it was actually even more of a squeeze, because remember, it was a winter election. The election was on the Thursday, results on the Friday, and then we had that 1 week in Parliament before the Christmas recess to do all the swearing in and pass the Withdrawal Act. So it was an even crazier week than we're having this period.
Yeah, we have had a couple of weeks now for people to swear. There's even been one member of Parliament who's had to swear in twice.
Yes, I saw that.
Clive Lewis, yes. When we were student politics, Clive Lewis was on the non-Labour left. He was on the far left, so Clive is remaining true to form. Yes, absolutely. I know he's a proud member of the party now, but he has his moments.
Well, but it is interesting, isn't it, Matthew, that this is quote-unquote a changed Labour Party. There are still quite a few members of what's known as the Socialist Campaign Group on the backbenches. John McDonnell, Clive Lewis, Diane Abbott.
Yeah, but all the names you mentioned were there before. So, and of course, they've been massively diluted. They've always been there. They were there under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. There were about 30 throughout the... Clive Lewis wasn't, but, you know, people like Dennis Skinner were. And there were always about 25 to 30. It's actually a similar number now. There have been very few additions, if any, actually, from the hundreds of new Labour MPs elected, because Keir kept an iron-like grip on the selection procedure, much to the left's upset.
The Speaker is on his feet. Let's listen in.
As I say about the duty and responsibility of honourable members, it will be starting with the Code of Conduct for members and the Behaviour Code. I begin by reminding honourable members of their duty to observe the Code of Conduct, the Behaviour Code, agreed by the House, and to behave with civility and fairness in all their dealings. Unacceptable behaviour will be dealt with seriously, independently, and with effective sanctions. Freedom of speech. The House asserts its privilege of freedom of speech. That privilege is enjoyed by members of Parliament only in their work in this House as private individuals. We are equal under the law with those whom we represent. It is there to ensure that our constituents can be represented by us without fear or favour. It is an obligation upon all of us to exercise that privilege and responsibility. Accuracy of members' contributions. It is incumbent of members to be accurate in what they say in this House and to correct any mistakes as soon as possible. All members can now submit written correspondences directly to Hansard to amend errors of fact of their...
So Lindsay Hoyle there, the Speaker, reading the rule book for MPs, because Miriam Cates, there are a lot of rules to the Chamber that a lot of new MPs might not necessarily know.
That's right, there are a lot of rules, there's also a lot of procedure to get your head around. I think the most difficult one is learning to address everybody in the third person, my honourable friend, the honourable lady, trying to remember who is a Privy Councillor and therefore is the right honourable lady, the right honourable friend. And it does seem a bit arduous to start with, but you soon work out why those rules are there and how they do keep the debate flowing and also respectful. So it is worth taking time to learn them.
Yes, and also finding your way around the Palace of Westminster is no easy feat.
Yes, no, absolutely, and it's very easy to get lost. And I think my advice would be, when you find the river, at least you know which is north or south.
Absolutely.
That's a good point.
Of course, there are lots of words that are unparliamentary. There's unparliamentary language, which members of Parliament are not allowed to use. They include git, traitor, walk,
careful, you could
squirt, sod, slimy, pipsqueak, ignoramus, or indeed hooligan.
I hope not many of those are on the Ofcom list, otherwise you're going to be in trouble.
Do you know what? I don't think gutter snipe is on the Ofcom list, whereas it is on the...
One of them, I think.
These are some of the best words in the English language.
And you definitely can't accuse anybody of lying.
Yes, that's the big
very,
one.
very
Yes,
important.
that's the biggest one of all, isn't it? And they've all been on their training over the last few days. I think both training from Parliament, training from the party as well. So it really is like kind of first day at school or first day in a new job.
And when you become a new MP, how quickly are you allowed to get out there on the media and start making a big name for yourself for song and dance?
Well, there's an argument that the wise ones don't do it straight away and sit back. I mean, one of the big issues in the Labour Party is that 4 people who have literally yet to make their maiden speeches, and they will be have been made ministers. And apparently you have to do your maiden speech before you become a minister, because obviously you can't go speak. So they have been fast-tracked. So the 4 and there is a lot of disquiet that they're at the front of the queue. And of course, because not only those 4 but several people in the Lords were pushed in, that means that there are already some disgruntlement of people who didn't get the job they were expecting or didn't get a job at all.
This is going to be a big risk for the Labour government with a massive majority, because huge numbers of backbenchers, probably 200, are never going to get a ministerial job this entire Parliament. And once they work that out and realise that their only opportunity for influence or making a legacy or creating a name for themselves is in the media and being a bit controversial, they could have some party management problems.
Now, of course, sometimes members of Parliament deliberately use unparliamentary language so that they create a fuss, they create a social media clip.
The SNP particularly were big on that.
The SNP was huge on it. They liked to be thrown out of the chamber and sort of show up the system for being terribly...
And get on the lead at Scotland at 6.
But it's only because they deliberately did something unparliamentary and then were removed from the chamber. For example, alleging... I think use of the word dodgy might be one of those words that sort of implies someone is dishonest and therefore falls within that lying category.
And then they refused to retract it after the Speaker asked them to. And I think that's the thing about the SNP that I certainly noticed, is because they don't really believe in Westminster, they don't believe in the constitutional rights of Westminster to rule the whole of the UK, they don't have the same respect for it as actually other MPs, and they sometimes do pull these stunts. I mean, sometimes they are quite amusing, sometimes quite serious. So I think you'll remember I think it was February this year, there was a vote about whether there should be a ceasefire in Gaza, and the SNP were denied their vote because of some behind-the-scenes wrangling between Keir Starmer and the Speaker. And actually, they all walked out of the chamber, and a lot of Conservative MPs followed. But obviously, the SNP have got very different motivations for using the chamber like that as perhaps Conservative MPs. But it's all part of the richness of our democracy.
And Matthew, part of the richness.
One of the things that I saw when Parliament obviously convened for the first time last week, and everyone was sort of in their new places on their new sides of the House, was all the Labour MPs started clapping when Keir Starmer walked into the room. Which
actually the SNP famously did when they had all their in 2015 when they had all their great hordes elected.
Entirely unparliamentary, and it's only because the Speaker had not at that point been elected that they could get away with it.
Yes, I mean, we have seen it occasionally in the chamber when there's been a big occasion, but it is very much frowned upon. They need to get the practice on their hears and their shouting, clapping very much.
And banging the back of the bench.
Yeah.
OK, well,
was there a round of applause for Craig McKinley?
There was.
Yes.
And for the Ukraine president, wasn't there?
Zelensky,
that's right, yeah.
And of course, when Tony Blair resigned as well, there was some... So very, very rarely. But of course, the SNP started clapping at just about everything.
Just to make a point.
They're the naughty schoolboys at the back.
But OK, then, why don't we all practice our hears? Of course, this is what MPs will have to be learning to do. Miriam, can you give one a go?
Hear.
Hear.
Oh, come on. Yeah, is what the sort of
that's the 1922 committee kind of version of it.
All these kind of 23-year-old Labour MPs will be very, very much of a culture shock for them.
You don't think they're going to go?
Well, I think that'd be welcoming the way the young people do.
Goodness me. I'm not going to humour you on that one, Tom.
You're not?
Absolutely no chance I'll go to. But yes, so Lindsay Hoyle's still on his feet.
There's a lot of rules.
A lot of rules and a lot of procedures. And, of course, hundreds, I think it's right to emphasise this point, hundreds of new MPs.
Yeah.
This has been one of the biggest change elections. The majority of MPs in Scotland, hundreds of new MPs in England, in Wales as well, dozens of new MPs. It's been a massive changing of the guard.
And it's going to take a long time to get through those maiden speeches, months and months and months. I would imagine that we'll still be having maiden speeches in January. And that's going to be very frustrating for people. And again, because you've got this huge imbalance, Labour have got an enormous majority, the way that it's speaking works in Parliament, so either in a debate or in question time, is you take it in turns, government, opposition. So Labour MPs will be lucky to get one Prime Minister's question a year. I mean, they really will. And in debates, they may have to sit there for 6, 7, 8 hours before they get to speak, and then they will only get there 3 minutes. So I think it's going to take time for them to really adjust to the procedures of Parliament.
It's very interesting you say that, because psychologically it must be tough. I mean, becoming an MP, you have to have self-confidence. Perhaps, dare I say, there may be a few who are self-important. And to have to just sit there and wait your turn, Matthew.
Well, yeah, I mean...
as you climb the greasy ladder, or attempt to, with not even one PMQ, perhaps, in your whole year.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the issues, you say people have to be quite self-confident. That is true. But there are so many of these Labour MPs who were not expected to win.
Shall we listen to Lucy Powell, the Leader of the House?
Be Chairman of Ways and Means, Dame Siobhan McDonough be First Deputy Chairman of Ways and Means, and Sir Christopher Chope be the Second Deputy Chairman of Ways and Means.
The question is that for the period up to the first sitting day following the election of the Deputy Speaker's under Standing Order number 2A, Sir Edward Lee be Chairman of Ways and Means, Dame Siobhan McDonough to be the First Deputy Chairman of Ways and Means, and Sir Christopher Chope to be Second Deputy Chairman of Ways and Means. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I now have to acquaint the House that the House has this day attended His Majesty's in the House of Peers, and that His Majesty was pleased to make the most gracious speech from the throne to both Houses of Parliament, of which I have the great accuracy obtained a copy. I shall direct that the terms of the speech be printed in votes, and the preceding copies are available in the vote office. Before I call the mover and the second of the debate, I want to announce the proposed pattern of debate during the remaining days of the Loyal Address. Today, debate of the address. Tomorrow, Foreign Affairs and Defence.
Now, we've heard some of the procedure there, electing the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. This is a very important committee in the House of Commons, and it so happens when the whole House sits together.
Yes, and I think also it is the Deputy Speaker. I mean, that is the important part of the role. So this was Dame Eleanor Lang in the last Parliament. I think they said it is Sir Edward Lee, who's very, very experienced. So we have one Speaker and 3 deputies, because obviously the Speaker can't sit there.
Let's listen to Peter Dowd.
In Parliament assembled, beg leave to offer our humble thanks to Your Majesty for the gracious speech which Your Majesty has addressed to both Houses of Parliament. Mr. Speaker, happy birthday to Her Majesty the Queen today. Yay. Mr. Speaker, it is an honour to be asked to give thanks to His Majesty. So can I start by congratulating you, Mr. Speaker, on your re-election, and a warm welcome to new and returning members, including my honourable friend, the late member for Stalybridge and Hyde. And congratulations to the Prime Minister and members of his new government. And Mr. Speaker, I think it's worthwhile putting into context how I came to be moving the motion on the King's speech this afternoon. Last Thursday morning, I was standing outside the library, minding my own business, watching somewhat bewildered honourable members wandering up and down corridors, tentatively popping their heads into the odd room that may or may not have been a broom cupboard. And, Mr. Speaker, they were actually the returning members. I can't imagine what it must have been like for the hundreds of new members, and of course it brought back memories of when I undertook similar meanderings in the corridors of power. Then came the call from the Chief Whip. My first thoughts were, oh dear.
Oh, yeah.
What have I done or not done, as the case may be? Fortunately, those thoughts soon dissolved when he kindly asked me if I would undertake the humble address, to which I was delighted to accept and relieved. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, I'm not the most competitive sort, which is just as well, as I'm afraid I can't claim to be the first to achieve virtually anything in my family. It started at birth, as I was the last born child. And although I was a councillor at a relatively young age, alas, I was not the first by a long measure from my family. I was the leader of a council, but not the first leader of a council in my family, nor even the first, for example, to unveil a plaque on a new public building. That was pretty much routine amongst my forebears. Nor will I be able to look forward to being the first person to reach 100 years of age in my family. My late grandmother, Nin, ticked that particular box in 1984 and drove the point home by living until she was 105. As for being the first MP in my family, well, I can't claim that accolade either, as there were two before me. One was the member, no surprises for guessing, Mr. Speaker, for Bootle constituency. And until today, my position in the back of the family queue has held sway for decades. So, thanks to a good Samaritan in the form of the Chief Whip, I am the first in my family to move the humble address to his Majesty. I am, as we say in Merseyside, made up. It goes without saying that being a member of Parliament is an honour, but I think being an MP representing the town I was born in is the icing on the cake. For those who don't know where my constituency is, it used to be a small fishing village, then a bathing resort for wealthy merchants just north of Liverpool. How times change. Today, my constituency comprises of a number of close-knit communities which, until after the war, were farmland. Ford, Litherland, Netherton and Old Rome. They comprised of the areas that housed thousands of families after the challenges of the war, and I think that vision can be renewed. Another part of my constituency, Seaforth, is home to the Port of Liverpool, and I'll come back to that in future debates. The country home of the Gladstone family was based in Seaforth. Indeed, Gladstone wrote how he had seen, quote, wild roses growing up on the very ground that is now the centre of Bootle. Another community oral expanded as time went by. Then, of course, there's the lovely coastline on Liverpool Bay, which has Waterloo and Crosby running along its shoreline, with beautiful views across to the hills of North Wales, and home to another place housing Anthony Gormley's Iron Men statues. And of course, Bootle Town Centre itself is now the home to many government offices, the Charity Commission, the Health and Safety Executive, and even the Office for Nuclear Regulation, amongst others. And given its location and its major dock system, during the war, Bootle was a major target of the Luftwaffe. It was left badly scarred, with as many as 85% of buildings destroyed or damaged. It paid more than its fair share during that conflict. So I'm proud of my communities and their history, so I want the contents of the gracious speech to be part of its future. Now, Mr. Speaker, as much as I would like to think that Bootle constituency, with the largest majority in the country, so I'm told, is down to my character, charm and charisma. well known to my colleagues, I really know it's down to the ambitious programme trailed in the general election campaign and now formally set out in the gracious speech. I welcome a legislative programme based on security, fairness and opportunity for all, investment, stability and reform. That's not a reference to the members over there. And perhaps above all, service. Service to our communities, our constituencies and our country. It's about securing economic growth, raising living standards, getting Britain building again with planning reform and quality infrastructure, recognising the challenges of climate change, harnessing technology, a clean energy transition and Great British Energy advancing investment into renewable energy is fundamental. If you like, Mr. Speaker, a sort of new social contract that delivers attainment in education, challenges antisocial behaviour, refreshes support for the victims of crime, protects our borders, enhances the rights of renters, a new deal for working people and the reinvigoration of our NHS amongst many other proposals. Mr. Speaker, a renewed local democratic settlement through the devolution proposal set out in the gracious speech is welcome. In short, Mr. Speaker, Westminster and Whitehall don't always know best. On a day-to-day basis, I'm looking forward to getting back to work, especially with new members, hundreds of them, and I will continue to work on various APPs that I'm involved in. But the gracious speech included proposals for a bill to champion our armed forces and their families, families being a key element in that proposal. I use that, therefore, as a prompt to mention the Armed Forces APPG, of which I'm a member. I also do this because as an associate member of my local Crosby Royal Naval Association, having links with local veterans, of whom there are over 12,000 in my constituency, as having members of my family in the Armed Forces, in addition to my mother and grandmother both having received war widows' pensions for decades, I feel the least I could do was to participate in the Armed Forces APPG. And in the last year, I participated in the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme, the RAF cohort, until it was so rudely interrupted by the general election. Whilst I'm always impressed, I have to say, with inter-service collaboration, I have to say as well, I'm even more impressed with the rivalry between them. But before I bring the veil down on this part of my contribution, Mr. Speaker, I want to relate the House an anecdote, just one of the many I could relate since participating in the scheme, about the nonchalant and insouciant rivalry between the services. When a member joins the scheme, and it's well worth joining, they will be asked to go to the Wellington Barracks nearby to be measured up for a uniform. When I arrived, I was led through the barracks to the stores. The conversation went as follows with a member of personnel who, it must be noted, was from the army. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you?" he greeted me. "Good morning. I'm here to be measured up for a uniform," I replied. "And which service will you be serving with, sir?" "The Royal Air Force," I answered. "In that case, sir," he said, "you'll be needing a set of silk pyjamas and a smoking jacket." They fit like a dream, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our country faces so many challenges, and I believe the wide-ranging proposals in the King's Speech will go a good deal of the way to tackling those challenges, both home and abroad. Finally, Mr. Speaker, only on Saturday evening I was at a function for one of my local charities, Sefton Women and Children's Aid, at Liverpool FC's Anfield Stadium, which is a real stretch as I'm an Everton supporter. But whilst there, I paid a visit to the memorial to the 97 victims of Hillsborough. So I want to pay particular attention to the inclusion of what has become known as a Hillsborough Law in the gracious speech. I also want to thank the many individuals, families, survivors and the coalition of other organisations who have campaigned selflessly for decades to achieve this outcome, including members of this House. It means so much to the families of the victims of those who died and the survivors from our city region and beyond that the government will be fulfilling its promise to ensure a duty of candour on public services. Justice and respect at last. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
It's also a privilege to call the seconder, Florence Eshalome.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I start by congratulating my friend, the Honourable Member for Bootle, on his fantastic speech. And as the eldest of 3 girls, we like the last-borns because we blame them for everything. And it's an honour to follow to second this loyal address, not only for me, but for my constituents across Vauxhall and Campbell Green. And Mr. Speaker, when I was asked by the Chief Whip, my excitement was quickly replaced by fear, because I then remembered my attempt to make a Big Shack reference during the second reading of the Procurement Act bill, which went completely over the head of the member for Brentwood and Ongar, and indeed many members in this chamber. See, I nearly backed out, but then I remembered that this is my opportunity to get on record that Nigerian jollof is the best jollof. Before the member for Erith and Thamesmead has other ideas. It's nearly 15 years since the last Labour member seconded a loyal address, and it was my good friend, the Right Honourable Member for Islington South and Finsbury. And I have to say, the notices I receive when she's visiting my constituency are perhaps my favourite. I once remember receiving a note from her office saying she was going to tour the Beef Eater Gin Distillery in my constituency the next evening, and that I should join her. Now, sadly, I don't drink gin, but I know that she drank my share. I can only say that I look forward to welcoming other members to my constituency many more times during this Parliament. And can I remind all of you that it is your duty to let me know if you are attending one of the many fabulous parties in Vauxhall and Campbell Green. Otherwise, I will be complaining to Mr. Speaker. And it truly is a wonderful constituency. We have the National Theatre, the BFI, the South Bank Centre, the Young and the Old Vic. The Old Vic, which is currently hosting a play about the life of an MP where James Corden turns out to be one of your constituents. Although I believe he lives in California, so maybe he should get in touch with the leader of the opposition. We also have the London Eye, which I'm sure the whole House will be delighted to know received permanent planning status earlier this year in May. That keeps it safe even from the clutches and planning reforms of the Chancellor and the Deputy Prime Minister. We have communities from all over the world, and even amongst the Sea of England shirts on Sunday, there were a few brave Spanish fans proudly wearing their colours, although, Mr. Speaker, they may have been just the SNP MPs. And we're also home. To a number of MPs, advocacy groups, journalists, which means sometimes when I'm trying to avoid a journalist or politely decline an invitation, I often get hit with the dreaded line, "Oh, but I'm a constituent as well." I do warn journalists and members that I'll continue with my policy of giving no special treatment when you come up to me with any casework. Like many continuing MPs, the area I represent has changed significantly in this election following the boundary review. This means that I sadly no longer represent one of the Brixton estates I grew up on, as well as my church and my old primary school. The church is central to my life, and it's a microcosm of Lambeth. After Mass, I can see the impatience on my family's face, as I often discuss varied casework from the congregation. And I just want to reassure my honourable friend, the member for Clapham and Brixton Hill, you are going to receive multiple blessings with all those varied caseworks. And I know the wards that I'll lose will be represented by her. But then again, Mr. Speaker, based on past experience, not all the journey lobbies will notice that anything's actually changed. If the House will indulge me, I wish to briefly speak to a couple of policy issues close to my heart and those of my constituents, which I'm most looking forward to working with the new Labour government on. Now, as an MP, one of the hardest conversations any of us will have are with the victims of violent crime. I've sat in many front rooms, holding grieving mothers and fathers, and they tell me about their loved ones who've been taken too soon. And with every hug and tear wiped away, I can feel their pain and the impact that this has on the wider siblings and other family members. Crime rips communities apart, leaving too many people vulnerable and open to exploitation. And one of the areas I'm proud of working on is on preventing abuse of gang-associated girls, whose mistreatment is sadly just one example of why our streets need to be safer. The Home Secretary's commitment to halving rates of violence against women and improving the support for victims should be welcomed across the House. Over the last couple of years, I've seen firsthand the impact of the cost of living crisis, and this has had on my constituents in Vauxhall and Campbell Green and communities right across the country. We all know that tackling climate change is one of the most urgent issues facing our world, and we cannot delay any meaningful action on this any longer. I'm therefore very pleased that the government is committed to addressing both these issues with an investment in clean energy transition that will lower energy bills for households, as well as restoring the UK's reputation as a climate leader. But Mr. Speaker, for millions of working people, real change will not come without action on housing. That's why I welcome the Deputy Prime Minister's plans to build 1.5 million new homes across the country, including a new wave of council houses, like the one that gave me and my family that security. You see, Mr. Speaker, I still remember that daily commute from a B&B in King's Cross and the excitement on my mum's face when we received the keys to permanent housing. We no longer had to lug our belongings in a black bag. But sadly, this is the case for so many people still in 2024. Vauxhall and Campbell Green is home to a high number of people, many of whom are private renters. The power that Section 21 gives immoral landlords to evict tenants for no reason is an outrage. I'm glad that this government will finally ban no-fault evictions for good. Lastly, I'm proud to be an advocate for the eradication of HIV and AIDS, an issue on which we have made so much progress in recent months. As my fellow co-chairs of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on HIV and AIDS, in November last year we had the honour of hosting a reception in Mr. Speaker's house to thank Sir Elton John for his work in this field over the last 40 years. It was a fantastic event, and our new Prime Minister reaffirmed his commitment to ending new HIV transmissions in the UK by 2030. Coincidentally, it also means that today's royal event, I've had the privilege of speaking, and it's the second one in the last 12 months, because we can all agree Sir Elton is music royalty. This Parliament sees a large churn of MPs, and may I take this opportunity to congratulate and welcome new members. Literally, do not worry if you get lost. I've been here almost 5 years and I still get lost. My one piece of advice is this: make sure you know where Westminster Hall is, because you'll always find the member for Strangford there, on hand to point you in the right direction. Although this is after he's finished speaking in whatever debate's going on that day. And Mr. Speaker, while it was wonderful seeing so many Labour MPs winning on the 4th of July, it was mixed with a slight sadness that we have to say goodbye to colleagues who worked across this House with great dedication for their constituents. I'm delighted to see the member for cities of London and Westminster in her place on these benches. But I'd like to reference the importance of the work I did with her predecessor, my friend Nikki Aitken. As the two MPs responsible for Westminster Bridge, we worked together in the last Parliament, not only to commemorate the horrific Westminster Bridge attack, which happened in 2017, where 6 people sadly lost their lives, including the late PC Keith Palmer. We also worked to improve the safety of what is a very busy and active part of London. Nikki also worked tirelessly to make sure the Pedicabs Act was brought into law, despite the persistent objections of the member for Christchurch, which, again, I'm sure many new members will get used to. I also pay tribute to the outgoing father of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley. Like new MPs and members, I remember walking in as a new MP into a meeting of the all-party parliamentary group for votes at 16. The room was buzzing with excitement and energy and all these young people. And to my surprise, Sir Peter was in the chair. He really proved that age is just a number. I must mention my good friend and former constituency neighbour, the new Baroness Harriet Harman. Her 42 years in office blazed the trail for the rights of women in politics and wider society. When Harriet was elected, just 3% of MPs were women. And now this figure stands at 40%. So while there's some way to go, that rise is a testament to her undaring work and drive from Harriet to never take no for an answer. And while I'm daunted to have the responsibility of representing parts of her former constituency in Camberwell Green, I could not have had a better example to learn from. My pledge to her and to the new constituents is that I will do my best to carry on her legacy and being a strong voice in Parliament for those communities. Lastly, I cannot think of a more fitting replacement as the mother of the house than my good friend, our auntie, the Right Honourable Member for Hackney South, North and Stoke Newington. She was elected when I was just 6 years old, and seeing her in the media making a voice of black women heard in Parliament gave me the confidence that I could stand here and make sure that people in my community could have a voice in the decisions that impact them. We stand on your shoulders and we respect and salute you. Thank you. I welcome the government's plan to introduce draft race equalities legislation to build on this work, and I look forward to working with ministers to develop it. We should not underestimate the difficulties that both Baroness Harman and the Right Honourable Member for Hackney North and Stoke Newington have gone through to make their voices heard, and the challenges they face even now. But their trailblazing examples means that those of us elected today face far fewer challenges in representing our communities, and we have more friends to go through those challenges with. And because of them, Mr. Speaker, it means that a black working class girl from a South London estate can stand before you today with the honour of seconding this loyal address.
The question is that the humble address be presented to His Majesty as follows. Most gracious Sovereign, we, Your Majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, the Commons of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, in Parliament assembled, beg leave to offer our humble thanks to Your Majesty for the gracious speech which Your Majesty has addressed to both Houses of Parliament. I now call the Leader of the Opposition, Rishi Sunak.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And before I turn to the address, I'm sure the whole House would like to join me in paying tribute to His Majesty the King. It is typical of his dedication to duty that despite the medical challenges he has recently faced, he was here today to open Parliament and will travel to the Commonwealth Hubs of Government meeting in Samoa and to Australia this autumn. The King is a true model of public service. I know that the Prime Minister will value his audiences with His Majesty as much as I did. And I think we all recognise that the King is aided by the constant support of Her Majesty the Queen. And I know the whole House will join me in wishing her a very happy birthday. Today we also pay tribute to Tony Lloyd. Tony served the people of Greater Manchester for 45 years, and for 36 of those as a member of this House.
He was a great parliamentarian, kind and wise. His family should have enormous pride in the contribution he made to this place and to the community that he loved and served. They are in all our thoughts today. I'd also like to welcome all new members to their places. Being elected as a Member of Parliament is a great honour and a great responsibility. We serve our communities and our United Kingdom. I know that whatever our political differences might be, we are all motivated by a desire to make life better for our constituents and our country stronger. Yeah. And I know that the whole House will join me in deploring the assassination